A nurse's hand should heal. His delivered death. In the ICU where patients fought for their lives, one man decided who would lose. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where the stories get darker and the truth cuts deeper. I'm glad you're here. If you enjoy these late-night truths, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. This is the story of the Angel of Death, Richard Angelo's Mercy Murders. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Thank you. The hospital corridors never sleep, and neither do the predators who walk them. Tonight, we're tracking a killer who wore scrubs instead of a mask, who wielded syringes like weapons, and who chose the dying as his victims, not out of hatred, but something far more twisted. The desperate, pathological need to be called a hero. Richard Angelo didn't just betray his oath. He weaponized it. Good Samaritan Hospital in West Islip, New York, 1987. Patients arrived broken, trusting the institution to mend them. They had no way of knowing that one of their caregivers was systematically injecting them with lethal doses of paralytic drugs, waiting for them to crash, then swooping in to save them. Some he rescued, others he let slip away, their final moments stolen by the very person meant to protect them. This is the story of a man who played God in the graveyard shift, and the trail of bodies that finally exposed him. Richard Angelo seemed ordinary, and that was precisely the point. Born in 1962, he grew up on Long Island in a working-class family that offered no obvious clues to the monster he would become. His childhood was unremarkable. No tales of animal torture, no violent outbursts, no early warnings that textbooks tell us to watch for. He was quiet, perhaps too quiet, the kind of kid who faded into the background of every classroom photo, every family gathering, every social interaction. But inside that silence, something festered. Angelo gravitated toward nursing school not out of compassion, but calculation. The medical field offered him something he craved more than money, more than sex, more than conventional power: the ability to control life itself. While his classmates spoke of wanting to help people, Angelo's motivations ran darker, though he concealed them behind a mask of professional competency. He graduated without incident, his instructors remembering him as adequate but forgettable. A dangerous combination in retrospect. Good Samaritan Hospital hired him in 1987 for their intensive care unit, the hospital's beating heart where the sickest patients clung to life by threads of medication and machinery. The ICU attracted a certain type of nurse. Those who thrived under pressure, who could make split-second decisions, who didn't flinch at the sight of death. Angelo fit perfectly, or so it seemed. He worked the night shift, when staffing ran thin and supervision grew lax, when the building itself seemed to exhale and settle into darker rhythms. His colleagues found him helpful, eager even, always volunteering to take on additional patients or assist with emergencies. If anything, they thought he cared too much, staying late to check on critical cases, arriving early to review charts. No one questioned his dedication. No one looked closely at the pattern emerging in his wake. Patients who had been stable suddenly coding, their bodies revolting against invisible assaults, their vital signs plummeting without explanation. The drugs Angelo chose revealed his medical knowledge and his cunning. Pavulon and anectine, powerful paralytic agents used legitimately during intubation and surgery. In proper doses, they relaxed muscles to allow breathing tubes. In Angelo's doses, they stopped breathing entirely. The beauty of his weapon, from his twisted perspective, was its traceability. These drugs metabolized quickly, vanishing from the bloodstream within hours. By the time anyone thought to test for them, they disappeared like ghosts, leaving only the mystery of sudden respiratory failure. But Angelo's compulsion wasn't about killing cleanly. He needed witnesses to his heroism. After injecting his victims, he would hover nearby, waiting for the inevitable collapse. Alarms would scream, staff would rush in, and there would be Angelo already performing chest compressions, barking orders, his hands working with practiced precision. Sometimes he succeeded in reviving them, sometimes he didn't, Either way, he'd created the emergency that allowed him to play savior. The psychology behind Angelo's crimes runs deeper than simple attention-seeking. Mental health experts who later examined his case identified it as Munchausen syndrome by proxy taken to its most lethal extreme. The need to create medical crises in others to receive recognition for resolving them. But unlike the typical cases involving mothers and their children, Angelo had access to dozens of potential victims and the medical expertise to harm them in ways that mimicked natural complications. His selection process showed chilling calculation. Angelo targeted the elderly and the already critical, patients whose deaths might be written off as inevitable, whose families might accept loss as God's will rather than murder. He avoided healthy patients or those with vigilant relatives who might ask uncomfortable questions. He hunted in the margins, where death was expected and scrutiny was minimal. The night shift became Angelo's hunting ground. Between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m., when attending physicians went home and skeleton crews managed entire wards, he had maximum opportunity and minimum oversight. The darkness outside matched the darkness in his actions. Patients drifted in and out of medicated sleep, unable to articulate the terror of paralysis, of feeling their bodies shut down while their minds remained trapped in conscious horror. One of his early victims, an elderly man recovering from cardiac surgery, experienced what should have been a routine recovery. His chart showed steady improvement, his family cautiously optimistic. Then Angelo worked his shift. The man coded twice in 4 hours, his body convulsing against restraints, his eyes wide with primal fear. Angelo revived him both times, earning praise from the attending physician the next morning. The patient survived but never truly recovered, his remaining months haunted by inexplicable panic attacks and night terrors. He couldn't remember what happened, the drugs ensured that, but his body remembered the violation. Angelo kept no trophies, maintained no diary, left no manifesto explaining his actions. His reward was intangible. The respect of colleagues, the gratitude of families, the rush of adrenaline when he saved someone he'd nearly killed. He was feeding an addiction as powerful as any substance, and like all addictions, it demanded increasing doses. The intervals between his attacks shortened. His confidence grew. He began to believe himself invincible. The hospital administration noticed nothing. Good Samaritan's mortality rates remained within normal parameters for an ICU. When deaths occurred, they were attributed to underlying conditions, to age, to the simple fact that not everyone who enters intensive care leaves alive. Angelo understood the statistics that protected him. He knew that a certain number of codes and deaths were expected, even anticipated. He hid his murders in the statistical noise of legitimate medical outcomes. But he made mistakes. Every serial killer does eventually. The human variable, unpredictable, uncontrollable, would be his undoing. Some of his victims survived when they shouldn't have, their resilience exceeding his calculations. Their bodies carried traces of his crimes, chemical fingerprints that would eventually point back to him. And one nurse, more observant than the rest, began to notice patterns where others saw only tragedy. October 1987 marked the acceleration of Angelo's killing spree, though no one recognized it as such yet. The autumn air outside carried the first hints of winter, but inside Good Samaritan's ICU, a different kind of cold had settled in. The cold of a predator growing comfortable in his hunting ground. Angelo had killed before, but now he was refining his technique, learning from each victim what worked and what left too many questions. His victims during this period included men and women ranging from their 60s to their 80s, each admitted with serious but treatable conditions. They should have recovered or at least died peacefully, surrounded by family, with dignity intact. Instead, they experienced terror beyond articulation. The paralytic drugs Angelo injected caused complete muscle paralysis while leaving consciousness intact, a medical nightmare where the mind remains alert but the body becomes a prison. Unable to breathe, unable to move, unable to scream, his victims drowned in air, their lungs frozen mid-breath, their hearts stuttering under the chemical assault. Girolamo Cusick, a 73-year-old patient, became one of Angelo's targets on October 11th. Cusick had been admitted for cardiac monitoring, his condition stable, his prognosis good. His family visited daily, his wife of 48 years rarely leaving his bedside except during shift changes. That evening, she kissed him goodbye, promised to return first thing in the morning, and went home to sleep. She should have stayed. Angelo entered Cusica's room during the quiet hours after midnight, when the hallway lights dimmed and most patients drifted in medicated sleep. He checked the door, confirmed no one was watching, then drew up his syringe with practiced efficiency. The injection took seconds. The effects took minutes. Cusica's body began to betray him. His breathing grew labored. His heart rate spiked, then plummeted. His eyes widened with confusion, then terror as his respiratory system shut down. The code alarm brought nurses running. Angelo was already there, performing textbook CPR, his voice calm as he called out vitals and barked orders. They intubated Cusick, pumped him full of emergency medications, shocked his heart back into rhythm. He survived the night but remained in critical condition, his recovery now uncertain. His family devastated by the sudden decline they couldn't understand. Angelo accepted their tearful thanks with practiced humility, playing his role perfectly. But Cusica's case differed from the others in one crucial way. He lived long enough to remember fragments of his ordeal. When he finally regained consciousness days later, he described to investigators a sensation of drowning while awake, of seeing Angelo's face above him before everything went dark. His testimony, confused and incomplete though it was, would later become crucial evidence. The human mind, even under chemical assault, sometimes holds onto pieces of truth. Frederick Lagois, age 71, wasn't so lucky. Admitted for respiratory issues, he was already vulnerable when Angelo selected him. The injection came on October 21st during another night shift, another opportunity. This time, the revival attempts failed. Lagois coded, crashed, and despite aggressive intervention, never recovered. The death certificate listed respiratory failure secondary to underlying pulmonary disease. His family grieved but didn't question. Why would they? Their father had been sick. The hospital had tried to save him. Sometimes medicine fails. They buried him believing nature had taken its course. Angelo attended the code personally, performing chest compressions with such vigor that he cracked 2 of Lagois's ribs, a detail noted in the autopsy report but attributed to aggressive life-saving measures. Medical examiners expect broken ribs from CPR. They don't expect murder. Lagois became another statistic, another elderly patient who died in the ICU. His true cause of death hidden behind legitimate medical terminology and Angelo's carefully constructed facade. The pattern continued through late October and into November. Margaret Gillespie, 80 years old, coded twice in one night during Angelo's shift. She survived but suffered severe neurological damage, spending her final weeks in a vegetative state before pneumonia claimed her. The hospital attributed her decline to her age and underlying conditions. No one suspected the nurse who'd worked so tirelessly to save her had been the one who'd pushed her to the brink. But cracks were beginning to show in Angelo's carefully constructed operation. The ICU nursing staff, particularly those who worked closely with him, started noticing disturbing coincidences. Patients seemed to code more frequently during Angelo's shifts. The pattern wasn't obvious. Angelo was smart enough to vary his timing and selection, but nurses operate on instinct as much as training. Several of them felt something was wrong without being able to articulate exactly what. Nurse Jennifer Connell became the first to voice suspicions. She'd worked at Good Samaritan for 12 years, long enough to know when something felt off. After witnessing her 4th emergency during Angelo's shift in 2 weeks, she approached the head nurse with concerns. Her observations were anecdotal, circumstantial, easily dismissed as coincidence or pattern-seeking in random events. The head nurse listened politely but took no action. ICU patients coded regularly. That's why they were in intensive care. But Connell couldn't let it go. She began keeping informal notes, documenting which patients crashed and when, which nurse was on duty, which medications were administered beforehand. Her documentation remained private, scribbled in a personal notebook rather than official reports. She feared seeming paranoid, worried about accusing a colleague without proof. Her hesitation was understandable and human, and it cost lives. Angelo, meanwhile, grew bolder. The successful revivals fed his ego, convinced him of his invincibility. He saw himself as essential, as the hospital's best crisis manager, as a nurse who saved lives others would have lost. The cognitive dissonance required to square that self-image with his actions reveals the depth of his psychopathy. He genuinely believed he was helping, that the patients he killed were acceptable casualties in his larger heroic narrative. His technique evolved. He learned to vary injection sites to avoid obvious track marks. He discovered optimal timing, late enough in the shift to ensure exhausted staff, but early enough to allow time for revival attempts. He studied which patients were monitored most closely and which were left relatively alone. Every murder taught him lessons that made the next one smoother, safer for him, more deadly for his victims. The hospital's corporate structure inadvertently aided Angelo's crimes. Good Samaritan operated like most American hospitals, understaffed, overworked, focused on profit margins and patient throughput. Nurses regularly handled twice as many patients as safety standards recommended. Oversight was minimal. Documentation was rushed. The perfect environment for a predator who understood the system's weaknesses. By mid-November, Angelo had attempted to murder at least 10 patients, successfully killing 4. But his compulsion was accelerating, his need for validation growing more desperate. The gaps between his attacks shortened from weeks to days. He was spiraling toward inevitable exposure, driven by urges he could no longer fully control. The question wasn't whether he'd be caught, but how many more would die before someone stopped him. The answer would come from an unexpected source: a patient's family member who refused to accept easy explanations, and a toxicology test that revealed what Angelo thought he'd hidden. His reign of terror was nearing its end, but the final chapter would claim more victims before justice arrived. The unraveling began with Nancy Stewart, a patient whose survival defied Angelo's intentions. She'd been admitted to Good Samaritan's ICU following surgery complications, her condition serious but manageable. On November 15, 1987, during Angelo's night shift, she became his next target. He injected her with Pavulon, expecting the familiar sequence of events: respiratory distress, code alarm, heroic intervention. But Stewart's body responded differently than the others. She didn't crash immediately. Instead, she experienced partial paralysis, enough to terrify her, but not enough to stop her breathing entirely. Her mind remained sharp even as her muscles weakened. She felt the strange sensation creeping through her body, recognized something was catastrophically wrong, and managed to hit her call button before losing motor control. When nurses arrived, they found her in acute distress, her eyes wide with terror, her body trembling, her breathing labored but not stopped. Angelo appeared moments later, ready to manage the crisis he'd created. But this time, the attending physician was still on the floor, handling another patient's admission. Dr. Michael Bergman reached Stewart's room quickly enough to observe symptoms that didn't match her medical history. The sudden onset, the specific pattern of muscle weakness, the terror in her eyes. Something felt wrong to him in a way he couldn't immediately identify. "Run a full tox screen," Bergman ordered, his instinct overriding standard protocols. Everything, including paralytics. The request was unusual. Hospitals don't routinely test for drugs they've administered themselves. But Bergman had learned to trust his gut over 20 years of emergency medicine. Angelo watched from the doorway, his expression neutral, but inside him something shifted. For the first time, real fear crept in. Stewart stabilized over the next hours, her body metabolizing the drug, her symptoms gradually resolving. She couldn't articulate what had happened. The drugs and trauma left her memories fragmented, but she kept repeating to nurses that something had been done to her, that someone had hurt her. Most dismissed it as ICU psychosis, the confusion that often affects critical care patients. But Dr. Bergman didn't dismiss anything. He waited for the tox screen results. 3 days later, the laboratory report landed on his desk with findings that changed everything. High levels of Pavulon in Stewart's system, far higher than any legitimate medical procedure would require. The drug had no business being in her body. She hadn't received it during surgery. No doctor had ordered it. Yet someone had injected her with enough paralytic to potentially kill her. Bergman immediately contacted hospital administration and the Suffolk County Police Department. Within hours, Good Samaritan Hospital became a crime scene. Detectives began reviewing records, interviewing staff, reconstructing the timeline of Stewart's near death. And every thread they pulled led back to Richard Angelo. The police investigation, led by Detective Sergeant Thomas Babbitt, started with the obvious question: who had access to Pavulon? The answer was disturbingly broad. Dozens of staff members could access the medication storage, and the hospital's inventory controls were lax at best. But when detectives cross-referenced access times with Stewart's timeline, Angelo's name surfaced. He'd been her primary nurse that night. He'd been in her room shortly before she crashed. And when they expanded their search, they discovered he'd been present for an alarming number of recent ICU emergencies. Babbitt, a 23-year veteran of the force, recognized the pattern immediately. He'd investigated hospital deaths before, knew how medical environments could camouflage murder. He assembled a task force and began the painstaking work of reviewing every death and every emergency in Good Samaritan's ICU over the previous 6 months. The list was long. ICUs see frequent codes, but certain cases stood out. The investigation focused on patients who'd experienced unexpected deterioration followed by emergency intervention, particularly those whose crashes couldn't be easily explained by their underlying conditions. Detectives ordered exhumations and requested tissue samples from recent deaths. The hospital, facing potential liability and public relations disaster, cooperated fully while simultaneously distancing itself from Angelo. On November 21, 1987, just 6 days after Nancy Stewart's near death, detectives brought Angelo in for questioning. The interrogation room was deliberately sparse. A table, 3 chairs, a recording device. Angelo arrived with a lawyer, already understanding the severity of his situation. But even faced with police scrutiny, his narcissism couldn't resist the opportunity to explain himself. The interrogation lasted 7 hours. Detectives Babbitt and Linda O'Brien employed classic techniques: building rapport, expressing understanding, offering Angelo opportunities to frame his actions in sympathetic terms. And slowly, incrementally, Angelo began to talk. He admitted to injecting patients with drugs. He claimed he did it to help them, to prevent emergencies by keeping them sedated. His explanations made no medical sense, but they revealed his distorted thinking. "I wanted to prove myself," Angelo said at one point, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to show I could handle the critical situations. I was good at it. I saved people." "By nearly killing them first?" O'Brien asked, keeping her voice neutral, non-judgmental. Angelo looked down at his hands. "I didn't mean for anyone to die. That wasn't supposed to happen." But the evidence told a different story. As the investigation deepened, forensic accountants tracked Angelo's access to medication storage. They discovered he'd withdrawn Pavulon and Anectine dozens of times when no legitimate procedures required them. The doses were unaccounted for, the drugs vanishing into patients' bodies without proper documentation. Exhumations provided the physical proof. Frederick Lagois's tissue samples contained elevated levels of Anectine, far beyond what his medical care required. Other victims showed similar chemical signatures. The drugs Angelo thought would disappear had left traces in muscle tissue, in organs, in the biological record of his crimes. Science was testifying against him. The hospital conducted its own internal investigation, trying to determine how Angelo had operated undetected for so long. The findings were damning. Inadequate medication storage security, poor documentation requirements, insufficient supervision of nursing staff, and a culture that discouraged questioning authority or reporting concerns. Multiple nurses had felt something was wrong but hadn't reported it through official channels. The institutional failures had enabled Angelo's killing spree as surely as his own psychopathy. Media coverage exploded. Angel of Death headlines dominated New York newspapers. the nickname a grim pun on Angelo's surname and his profession. Television news crews camped outside Good Samaritan Hospital, interviewing terrified former patients and grieving families who were now questioning whether their loved ones had died naturally or been murdered. The hospital's reputation collapsed overnight. Families of deceased patients demanded answers. Many had accepted deaths as natural, as God's will, as the inevitable outcome of serious illness. Now they faced the possibility that their loved ones had been murdered by the person meant to care for them. The betrayal cut deeper than any scalpel. Parents, spouses, and children who'd thanked Angelo for trying to save their family members now realized he'd been the killer. District Attorney Patrick Henry moved quickly to build a prosecution case. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming. Angelo's presence at numerous unexplained codes, his access to lethal drugs, his withdrawals of medications without documentation, the chemical evidence from victims' bodies, and most damning, his own admissions during interrogation. Henry charged Angelo with multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, assault, and reckless endangerment. The legal strategy focused on establishing pattern and practice rather than proving each individual murder beyond doubt. Prosecutors knew that medical cases presented unique challenges. Defense attorneys could argue that ICU patients die frequently, that codes are common, that the presence of medications proves nothing in a hospital setting. But the sheer accumulation of evidence, 10, 15, possibly 20 victims, painted a picture no jury could ignore. Angelo's defense team, led by public defender Richard Schaefer, faced an impossible task. Their client had essentially confessed, the physical evidence supported the charges, and public opinion had already convicted him. Their strategy became damage control, arguing that Angelo suffered from mental illness, that he hadn't intended to kill, that his actions stemmed from pathology rather than malice. It was a desperate play, but the only one available. Psychiatric evaluations revealed the depth of Angelo's disturbance. Dr. Michael Stone, a forensic psychiatrist, diagnosed him with severe personality disorders including narcissistic and antisocial traits, along with the medical variant of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Angelo genuinely believed himself heroic even as he acknowledged injecting patients without orders. His ability to rationalize his actions as helpful demonstrated profound psychological dysfunction. But mental illness, the prosecution argued, didn't equate to legal insanity. Angelo knew his actions were wrong. He'd hidden them, lied about them, and felt fear when caught. He'd understood right from wrong even while choosing wrong repeatedly. His disorders explained his behavior but didn't excuse it. As the case moved toward trial, investigators continued uncovering victims. The final count remained uncertain. Angelo himself couldn't or wouldn't provide accurate numbers. He'd lost track of his crimes, the victims blurring together in his memory. Prosecutors identified at least 10 attempted murders and 4 confirmed deaths directly attributable to Angelo's injections, but suspected the true number was significantly higher. The trial of Richard Angelo began on December 14, 1989, more than 2 years after his arrest. The delay had allowed prosecutors to build an exhaustive case and given Angelo's defense team time to prepare their strategy. The courtroom in Riverhead, New York, became the setting for a legal proceeding that would captivate the nation and force uncomfortable questions about hospital safety, oversight, and the monsters who hide in plain sight. Judge Alfred Tisch presided over proceedings that lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution called 73 witnesses, including surviving victims, family members of the deceased, medical experts, toxicologists, and the nurses who'd finally recognized Angelo's pattern. Each testimony added another brushstroke to a portrait of methodical murder disguised as medical care. Nancy Stewart took the stand early in the trial, describing her terrifying experience. "I felt my body shutting down," she testified, her voice shaking with remembered fear. "I couldn't move, couldn't breathe right, but my mind was screaming. I knew something terrible was happening to me, and I saw him standing there, watching, waiting." Her testimony devastated the courtroom. Jurors wept openly. Spectators gasped. Even hardened court officers looked away. Stewart's survival gave voice to the victims who couldn't testify, who died without understanding what was being done to them, She spoke for the silenced. Dr. Michael Stone, the forensic psychiatrist, provided crucial context for understanding Angelo's psychology. He explained how Angelo's desperate need for recognition combined with access to lethal means created the perfect storm for serial killing. He wasn't a sadist, Stone testified. He didn't enjoy suffering, but he needed to be seen as heroic so badly that he was willing to create emergencies, to risk lives, even to accept occasional deaths as the price of his ego gratification. The defense's psychiatric experts attempted to portray Angelo as profoundly mentally ill, arguing diminished capacity. They described his childhood emotional neglect, his low self-esteem, his inability to form normal relationships. Dr. Patricia Breslin testified that Angelo suffered from severe personality disorders that impaired his judgment and made him incapable of understanding the full consequences of his actions. But the prosecution demolished this defense during cross-examination. They showed that Angelo had functioned normally in society, held a job requiring complex decision-making, maintained relationships, paid bills, and navigated daily life successfully. Most critically, he'd hidden his crimes, demonstrating consciousness of guilt. If he knew to hide what he was doing, Assistant District Attorney Edward Jablonski argued, he knew it was wrong. The toxicology evidence proved devastating to the defense. Expert witnesses walked the jury through chemical analyses showing lethal doses of pavulon and anectine in victims' tissues. They explained how these drugs shouldn't have been present in any concentration in patients who hadn't undergone procedures requiring them. The scientific testimony was dry but damning, cold chemical facts that proved warm-blooded murder. Angelo himself never testified. His lawyers, recognizing the danger of putting him on the stand, kept him silent throughout the trial. Prosecutors had hoped to cross-examine him, to force him to explain his actions before the jury, but they had enough evidence without his testimony. His recorded confession, played for the jury, provided his voice in the proceedings even as he sat mute at the defense table. The most emotionally wrenching testimony came from families of the deceased. Patricia Lagois, widow of Frederick Lagois, described her husband's final days. "He was getting better," she sobbed. "The doctors said he was improving. Then suddenly he crashed, and they couldn't bring him back. For 2 years I blamed God for taking him. Now I know it wasn't God. It was him." She pointed at Angelo, her fingers shaking with rage and grief. Similar stories repeated throughout the trial. Each family had trusted the hospital, trusted the system, trusted the nurse caring for their loved one. Each had been betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. The courtroom became a space for collective grief, for families processing the realization that they'd thanked their loved one's killer, that they'd shaken his hand, that they'd been manipulated by a predator in medical scrubs. The prosecution's closing argument lasted 4 hours. Edward Jablonski methodically reviewed the evidence, connecting Angelo to each victim, establishing means, opportunity, and motive. Richard Angelo didn't kill because he hated his victims, Jablonski told the jury. He killed because he loved himself more. He valued his ego, his need for recognition, his desperate hunger to be seen as a hero more than he valued human life. He turned an ICU into his personal stage, and his patients became props in his narcissistic fantasy. The defense's closing focused on mental illness and lack of intent. Richard Schaefer argued that Angelo never meant to kill, that he was a sick man who needed treatment rather than punishment, that his actions stemmed from pathology beyond his control. "You're being asked to convict a man who is profoundly mentally ill," Schaefer pleaded. "Yes, he did terrible things. Yes, people died. But he's not a monster. He's a human being whose mind is broken." The jury deliberated for 9 days, an unusually long period that suggested serious internal debate. When they returned, they'd reached verdicts on all counts. Guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder for Frederick Lagois and another victim, Joseph Secchi. Guilty of 1 count of second-degree manslaughter, guilty of multiple counts of assault, and guilty of criminally negligent homicide. They'd rejected the insanity defense but acknowledged Angelo's mental state through the specific guilty verdicts, which suggested diminished but not absent capacity. Judge Tisch sentenced Angelo on February 5, 1990. The proceeding lasted 3 hours, during which victim impact statements filled the courtroom with raw emotion. Tisch sentenced Angelo to 50 years to life in prison, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. "You betrayed your profession, your patients, and society itself," Tisch said. "You transformed a place of healing into a place of terror. You deserve to spend the remainder of your days in prison, and that is precisely where you will be." Angelo showed no emotion during sentencing. He'd remained largely impassive throughout the trial, his face a mask that revealed nothing of his internal state. Even facing life imprisonment, he maintained the same flat effect that had allowed him to inject helpless patients, then calmly return to his duties. The aftermath extended far beyond Angelo's conviction. Good Samaritan Hospital faced dozens of civil lawsuits from victims' families, eventually paying millions in settlements. The hospital implemented sweeping policy changes, enhanced medication tracking, improved oversight of nursing staff, mandatory reporting protocols, and psychological screening for employees. But no policy could restore the trust that Angelo had destroyed. The nursing profession grappled with uncomfortable questions. How had Angelo passed through nursing school without anyone recognizing his pathology? Why had concerns from colleagues been dismissed? What systemic failures had enabled his crimes? Professional organizations implemented new ethics training and screening protocols, but the fundamental question remained: how do you identify predators who present as caregivers? Angelo's case prompted legislative action. New York passed laws requiring enhanced background checks for medical professionals and mandating reporting of suspicious patient deaths. Other states followed suit. The Angelo laws, as they became known, aimed to prevent similar predators from infiltrating healthcare settings. Whether they succeeded remains debatable. Medical serial killers continue to emerge, suggesting systemic vulnerabilities persist. Victims and their families faced long-term psychological trauma. Surviving victims like Nancy Stewart suffered PTSD, nightmares, and profound mistrust of medical care. Many required years of therapy to process their experiences. Families of deceased victims experienced complicated grief, unable to achieve closure because they couldn't know for certain whether their loved one was murdered or died naturally. Angelo had stolen not just lives, but the peace that comes with understanding. Richard Angelo currently serves his sentence at Clinton Correctional Facility in upstate New York. He's been denied parole multiple times and will be eligible again in 2030, when he'll be 68 years old. Prison records indicate he's been a model inmate, quiet and compliant. He works in the prison library and has earned a degree through correspondence courses. He's given no interviews, issued no apologies, offered no additional information about his crimes. Mental health professionals continue to study Angelo's case as an example of medical serial killing. His profile differs from typical serial killers. He didn't kill for sexual gratification, financial gain, or apparent hatred of victims. His motive was purely egoistic, the need to be admired, to be seen as competent, to matter. This psychological profile appears in other medical killers, suggesting a specific subset of predatory behavior unique to healthcare settings. The true victim count remains unknown. Prosecutors proved 10 attempted murders and 4 completed murders, but investigators believe Angelo's actual toll was significantly higher. Between 1987 and his arrest, at least 35 suspicious deaths occurred in Good Samaritan's ICU during Angelo's shifts. Some were certainly natural deaths, but others remain questionable. Angelo himself has never provided a complete confession, leaving families in permanent limbo about their loved ones' deaths. Good Samaritan Hospital no longer exists under that name. The institution merged with another healthcare system in 1995, partly to escape the stigma of the Angelo case. The building still operates as a medical facility, but the ICU where Angelo hunted has been completely renovated, as if new walls and fresh paint could exorcise the memory of what happened there. The case of Richard Angelo stands as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it arrives in the uniform of a helper, wearing the mask of compassion, speaking the language of care. Angelo didn't look like a monster. He looked like a nurse, and that ordinariness, that ability to blend into an environment built on trust, made him infinitely more dangerous than any obvious predator could be. In the end, Angelo's legacy is written in the lives he stole and the trust he shattered. He proved that hospitals, despite all their safeguards and protocols, remain vulnerable to predators who understand the system. He demonstrated that the same knowledge that saves lives can be weaponized by someone with the right combination of access, intelligence, and profound psychological disturbance. And he left behind families who will never know peace, victims who died in terror, and a profession that still struggles with the knowledge that one of their own became a killer. The angel of death no longer wears scrubs. He wears prison orange. But the darkness he revealed in American healthcare casts shadows that haven't fully lifted. Every patient who enters an ICU now exists in a space Angelo helped contaminate with suspicion. His crimes didn't just end lives. They wounded the fundamental trust between healer and patient that medicine requires to function. Richard Angelo will die in prison. But the fear he created, the questions he raised, and the systemic vulnerabilities he exploited will outlive him. That may be his truest and most lasting crime. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Injection Killer. William Dale Arkard's 40-year reign of medical murder. A needle pierces skin, insulin floods the bloodstream, and somewhere in the shadows, a killer smiles. They called it natural causes. They called it tragic misfortune. They never called it what it was, until the bodies kept stacking up. We're tracking a predator who turned medicine into murder, a man who discovered that the perfect weapon doesn't explode or bleed. It dissolves into the bloodstream without a trace. For 4 decades, William Dale Arkard moved through California like a ghost in a white coat, leaving a trail of corpses that doctors signed off as heart attacks, strokes, and diabetic complications. He didn't need guns or knives. He had something far more sinister. Insulin, that life-saving hormone that, in the wrong hands, becomes an invisible executioner. This is the story of a killer who weaponized trust, who understood that nobody suspects the caring husband, the devoted friend, the man who stays by your bedside until your very last breath. Tonight, we descend into the methodical nightmare of America's most patient serial killer. A man who proved that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from the stranger in the alley, but from the familiar face holding your hand as your heart stops beating. The summer heat of 1947 pressed down on Southern California like a suffocating blanket, but inside the modest Los Angeles home of Zella Winders, something far colder was brewing. William Dale Arkard, 27 years old with movie star looks and a smile that could charm birds from trees, had recently married this woman. His first wife, though certainly not his last. Zella was everything Arkard needed at that moment. Vulnerable, trusting, and conveniently insured. She had no idea that the handsome man who whispered sweet promises into her ear at night was already calculating the exact dosage that would stop her heart. Arkard wasn't born a monster. He was carefully constructed, piece by piece, through years of petty crimes, failed schemes, and an insatiable hunger for easy money. Born in 1912, he'd spent his youth drifting through various occupations: door-to-door salesman, aspiring actor, confidence man. He possessed that dangerous combination of superficial charm and absolute moral vacancy. People liked him instantly. They trusted him. That trust would prove fatal. But Zella Winders Arkard survived her marriage, though barely. Whatever Arkard attempted during those early years, whether through incompetence, interrupted opportunity, or simple bad luck, it didn't stick. They divorced in 1948, and Zella walked away with her life, though she'd later tell investigators she always felt something was wrong, something she couldn't quite name. That primal instinct, that reptilian brain screaming danger while the conscious mind makes excuses, had saved her. Arkard moved on as predators do. His next wife, Juanita Plum, wasn't as fortunate. They married in 1952, and suddenly, mysteriously, Juanita developed debilitating health problems. Doctors were baffled. This previously healthy woman was experiencing episodes of confusion, weakness, trembling, classic symptoms of hypoglycemia, though nobody made that connection at the time. Arkard played the devoted husband beautifully, showing up at hospitals with flowers, sitting by her bedside with concern etched across his handsome features. The nurses whispered about what a lucky woman Juanita was to have such a caring spouse. Then Juanita died. Heart failure, the death certificate read. She was barely 40 years old. Arkard collected the insurance money, played the grieving widower for an appropriate period, then began hunting again. Here's what makes Arkard particularly terrifying. He was learning. Each attempt, successful or not, taught him something new. He was discovering the art of invisible murder, refining his technique like a craftsman perfecting his trade. And he'd stumbled onto something brilliant: insulin. This miracle drug that saved thousands of diabetics could, in massive doses administered to non-diabetics, create a cascade of biological horror. Blood sugar would plummet. The brain, starved of glucose, would begin shutting down. Confusion, seizures, coma, death. And here's the beautiful part from a killer's perspective. Insulin breaks down rapidly in the body. No residue, no trace, just another tragic case of natural causes. By 1956, Arkard had perfected his approach. He'd married again. Wife number 3, a woman named Bernie Arkard. He'd taken out substantial life insurance policies on her, and he'd begun the slow, methodical process of killing her. Small doses at first, just enough to make her sick, to establish a medical history of mysterious illness. Doctors would document her symptoms, creating a paper trail that would later explain her death. It was diabolical in its sophistication. Bernie started experiencing strange episodes. She'd feel fine one moment, then suddenly weak and disoriented the next. Doctors ran tests, found nothing conclusive, prescribed various medications. Arkard was always there, the concerned husband, asking questions, taking notes, making sure everyone knew how devoted he was to his suffering wife. He was building his alibi in real time, creating a narrative where he was the victim too, the loving spouse watching helplessly as his wife's mysterious condition deteriorated. But Bernie Arkard also survived. Whether through divine intervention, medical intervention, or simple chance, she lived through whatever Arkard was doing to her. They divorced in 1965, and like Zella before her, Bernie walked away with her life and a nagging feeling that something had been deeply, fundamentally wrong with her marriage. 3 wives, 3 suspicious patterns of illness, 2 survivors. Arkard was getting impatient. He'd spent nearly 2 decades perfecting his method, and he had nothing to show for it but failed attempts and divorce settlements. He needed to be bolder, more aggressive. He needed to stop making mistakes. What Arkard didn't realize was that he was leaving breadcrumbs. Each hospital visit, each insurance policy, each mysterious illness was creating a pattern. It wasn't visible yet. Not to the doctors, not to the insurance companies, not to law enforcement. But it existed, lurking in medical records and file cabinets, waiting for someone to connect the dots. The transformation was complete by the late 1960s. William Dale Arkard had evolved from a bumbling amateur into something far more dangerous. A methodical, patient killer who understood that the key to getting away with murder wasn't cleverness or violence. It was time. Give the poison time to work. Give the doctors time to document mysterious symptoms. Give the insurance company time to feel confident they're not being scammed. And most importantly, give everyone around you time to see you as the caring, devoted, heartbroken victim of tragic circumstances. Arkard was ready. He'd served his apprenticeship. The bodies were about to start piling up in earnest. And for the next decade, he would prove himself to be one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. all while hiding in plain sight, armed with nothing more than a syringe, a vial of insulin, and an absolutely terrifying understanding of human biology. The truly horrifying part? He was just getting started. Mary Brinker Post wasn't just another victim. She was Arkard's blueprint for success. A wealthy widow with substantial assets and no immediate family to ask uncomfortable questions. She represented everything Arkard had been searching for. They met in 1966, and Arkard deployed his full arsenal of charm. He was attentive, sophisticated, cultured. He listened to her stories about her late husband. He made her laugh. He made her feel alive again. And then, after a whirlwind courtship, he made her his fourth wife. The marriage certificate was barely dry when Arkard began implementing his plan. But this time, he added a new element of sophistication. He didn't just take out insurance policies. He systematically positioned himself to inherit everything Mary owned. Real estate, investments, cash accounts, all of it was gradually legally transferred into joint ownership. On paper, it looked like the natural progression of a loving marriage. In reality, it was a heist conducted in slow motion. Mary's health problems began almost immediately. She experienced episodes of confusion and weakness. Her hands would shake uncontrollably. She'd break out in cold sweats for no apparent reason. Arkard took her to the best doctors in Los Angeles, played the concerned husband perfectly. The medical establishment was baffled. They ran tests for everything: thyroid problems, neurological disorders, rare metabolic conditions. Nothing explained Mary's deteriorating condition. Then, on a quiet evening in September 1967, Mary Brinker Post died. Arkard called the ambulance, performed CPR, wept openly when the paramedics declared her dead. The death certificate listed cardiac arrest secondary to diabetic complications, even though Mary had never been diagnosed with diabetes. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? Her husband was devastated. The doctors had documented her mysterious illness. Everything pointed to a tragic case of undiagnosed disease. Arkard collected over $90,000, a fortune in 1967, equivalent to nearly $750,000 today. He played the grieving widower for exactly the right amount of time, then began shopping for wife number 5. He found her in Bernie Arkard, not to be confused with his third wife Bernie, a woman he married in 1968. The pattern repeated with horrifying precision. Insurance policies, mysterious illnesses, hospital visits, and then death. Bernie died in 1972, leaving Arkard substantially wealthier. The doctors signed off on natural causes. The insurance companies paid out. Nobody suspected a thing. But here's where Arkard's compulsion began outpacing his caution. He wasn't content with just killing his wives anymore. He'd discovered something intoxicating. He liked killing. The power, the control, the godlike ability to decide who lived and died. It fed something dark and insatiable inside him. And there were so many other people out there, people with insurance policies, people who trusted him, people who would never suspect that the friendly face offering help was actually measuring them for a coffin. Arkard began cultivating friendships with an ulterior motive. He'd meet someone, usually through social circles or business connections, and immediately assess their potential. Did they have money? Were they isolated? Could he get close enough to access their homes, their medicine cabinets, their vulnerable moments? If the answer was yes, Arkard would begin the slow seduction of trust. Letitia Cody was one of these victims. A family friend who'd known Arkard for years. She never suspected that his offers to help with household tasks were reconnaissance missions. When Letitia began experiencing mysterious health problems in 1977, Arkard was right there, offering to drive her to doctor's appointments, helping her fill prescriptions, even offering to organize her medications so she wouldn't get confused about dosages. He was positioning himself for the kill, and nobody around him had the slightest clue. Letitia died in March 1977. Another heart attack, another insurance payout, another perfectly executed murder that fooled everyone from the emergency room doctors to the coroner to the grieving family members who thanked Arkard for being such a good friend during Letitia's final weeks. But cracks were forming in Arkard's facade. Small things at first. an insurance investigator who thought the timing of a policy was suspiciously convenient, a doctor who noticed that several of Arkard's close associates had died under similar circumstances, a family member who started asking uncomfortable questions about why Arkard was always around when tragedy struck. These warning signs should have made Arkard more careful. Instead, they made him more aggressive. He'd gotten away with it for so long, collected so much money, fooled so many people that he'd developed an almost supernatural confidence in his invincibility. He genuinely believed he was smarter than everyone else, that his method was perfect, that he'd never be caught. This arrogance would prove to be his downfall. But not yet. Not for several more years and several more bodies. The most chilling aspect of this period in Arkard's killing spree is the sheer mundanity of it all. He wasn't a raging psychopath. He wasn't hearing voices or operating under delusions. He was simply a man who'd discovered that murdering people for insurance money was easier and more profitable than working a regular job. He'd turned serial killing into a career, complete with target selection, strategic planning, and performance metrics measured in death certificates and insurance checks. By 1977, Arkard had likely killed at least 7 people. Possibly more that we'll never know about because their deaths were never connected to him. He'd collected hundreds of thousands of dollars. He'd perfected his method to the point where he could execute a murder with almost no risk of detection. And he was absolutely convinced that he'd continue getting away with it forever. He was wrong. Frank Stewart Sr. never saw it coming. The 60-year-old man had befriended Arkard through mutual acquaintances, and over months of casual interaction, Arkard had assessed him as the perfect target. Frank was in good health but had recently taken out a substantial life insurance policy, naming Arkard as the beneficiary, a decision Arkard had carefully, subtly encouraged over drinks and friendly conversations. To Frank, it seemed reasonable. He had no close family, and Arkard had been such a good friend, helping him with various tasks, offering companionship. Naming Arkard as his beneficiary was simply good sense, ensuring someone reliable would handle his affairs. It was exactly what Arkard wanted him to think. Frank began experiencing strange health problems in early 1977. Episodes of confusion, weakness, trembling. The same symptoms that had plagued so many of Arkard's previous victims. But this time, something was different. Frank's nephew, suspicious of how quickly his uncle's health had deteriorated and troubled by Arkard's constant presence, started asking questions. He contacted Frank's doctor. He reviewed the insurance policy, and he noticed something that others had missed. This pattern had happened before to other people connected to William Arkard. The nephew went to the police. Detective Sergeant Charles Gunter of the Los Angeles Police Department caught the case. A methodical investigator with decades of experience, Gunter had the instincts of a bloodhound and the patience of a chess master. When he started pulling records on William Dale Arkard, what he found was staggering. Multiple wives, dead. Multiple friends and acquaintances, dead. All under similar circumstances. All with Arkard as beneficiary on insurance policies. All declared natural causes. Gunter knew he was looking at a serial killer, but proving it would be nearly impossible. Arkard's victims had been cremated or buried years ago. Any physical evidence was long gone. All Gunter had were suspicious patterns, coincidental deaths, and a growing certainty that he was hunting one of the most prolific killers in California history. Then Frank Stewart Sr. died on September 8, 1977. And for the first time in 3 decades, Arkard had made a critical mistake. Frank's nephew, already suspicious and working with police, had insisted on a complete autopsy. The coroner performed an exhaustive examination, running every test available. And there it was, the smoking gun that Arkard thought was impossible to find. Frank's blood glucose levels were catastrophically low, far below what any natural process could explain. The insulin levels in his system were astronomically high. The coroner's conclusion was unambiguous. Frank Stewart Sr. had been murdered by insulin poisoning. Gunter moved fast. He obtained warrants, seized Arkard's financial records, and began the painstaking process of documenting 3 decades of suspected murders. What he discovered was a killing spree of almost incomprehensible scope. At least 7 confirmed victims, possibly more. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in insurance payouts. A paper trail of death stretching back to the late 1940s. On November 27, 1977, William Dale Arkard was arrested and charged with the murder of Frank Stewart Sr. He was 65 years old, still handsome, still charming, still absolutely convinced he would talk his way out of trouble like he'd done his entire life. When Detective Gunter read him his rights, Arkard smiled and said he was happy to cooperate, that this was obviously some terrible misunderstanding. That confidence lasted until Gunter started laying out the evidence. Insurance policies, medical records, timelines showing that every single person who died had been healthy until they became close to Arkard. Financial documents proving that Arkard had systematically positioned himself to profit from each death. And the autopsy report on Frank Stewart Sr., with its damning evidence of insulin poisoning. Arkard's smile disappeared. He demanded a lawyer and stopped talking. But the damage was done. Gunter had him, and they both knew it. The district attorney's office faced a dilemma. They had solid evidence for Frank Stewart's murder, but they wanted Arkard charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder to prosecute him for the full scope of his killing spree. The problem was proving the older cases. The bodies were gone. The physical evidence had long since decomposed or been destroyed. All they had were patterns, coincidences, and circumstantial evidence. So they made a calculated decision. They would charge Arkard with multiple murders but focus the trial on the cases where the evidence was strongest. Frank Stewart Sr. and 2 other victims where investigators could build compelling circumstantial cases. They would use the other deaths to establish a pattern, to show the jury that this wasn't a one-time crime of opportunity but a systematic campaign of murder for profit spanning decades. As prosecutors prepared their case, more victims came forward. Not murder victims, but survivors. Women who'd been married to Arkard and had mysteriously become ill. Friends who'd experienced strange health problems after Arkard had taken an interest in their affairs. People who'd escaped death by sheer luck or chance, who'd never understood why their bodies had betrayed them until they saw Arkard's arrest on the news. Their testimonies painted a picture of a predator of almost supernatural patience, a man who would spend months or even years positioning himself for a kill, who viewed human beings as nothing more than financial opportunities, whose charm and charisma were tools as deliberately deployed as the syringes he used to inject his victims with death. The trial was scheduled for 1978. Arkard sat in his cell, still believing he could win, still convinced his intelligence would triumph over the evidence against him. He'd spent 40 years outsmarting doctors, investigators, and insurance companies. Why should a jury be any different? He was about to find out. The courtroom fell silent on March 6, 1978, as the prosecution began laying out its case against William Dale Arkard. The trial would become one of the most complex medical murder cases in California history, a deep dive into the dark art of insulin poisoning and the psychology of a man who turned killing into a profession. Lead prosecutor Michael Jeanlin knew he faced significant challenges. Insulin poisoning was rare. Most doctors had never encountered a case in their entire careers. The jury would need to understand complex medical concepts, metabolic processes, and pharmacological evidence. They'd need to grasp how someone could die from a substance that saved millions of diabetics' lives daily. And they'd need to see past Arkard's charm, past his apparent normalcy, to recognize the calculating predator beneath. Jenelin's strategy was brilliant in its comprehensiveness. He didn't just focus on Frank Stewart Sr.'s murder. He took the jury on a chronological journey through Arkard's entire killing career, demonstrating pattern after pattern, coincidence after coincidence, until the sheer weight of accumulated evidence became overwhelming. The medical testimony was damning. Expert after expert explained how insulin works, how the body regulates blood sugar, and what happens when massive doses of insulin are introduced into a non-diabetic person's bloodstream. They described the symptoms: confusion, weakness, trembling, seizures, coma, death. Symptoms that matched perfectly with what every single one of Arkard's victims had experienced before dying. The financial evidence was equally devastating. Forensic accountants walked the jury through Arkard's finances, showing how insurance payments corresponded exactly with deaths, how Arkard had systematically positioned himself as beneficiary, how he'd lived well beyond his legitimate means for decades, funded entirely by death benefits and inheritance from people who'd made the fatal mistake of trusting him. But the most powerful testimony came from the survivors. The wives who'd divorced him, the friends who'd grown suspicious, the relatives who'd watched their loved ones deteriorate under Arkard's care. They described his pattern of behavior. The initial charm, the gradual isolation of the victim, the offers to help with medical care, the constant presence during illness, and always, the insurance policy's position just right to ensure Arkard would profit from death. One witness, a former neighbor, described seeing Arkard entering Frank Steward's apartment late at night, carrying a small medical bag. Another testified about finding empty insulin vials in Arkard's trash. Strange, since Arkard wasn't diabetic and had no medical training. A third described how Arkard had quizzed him about insulin dosages, claiming he was researching a novel he planned to write. The pieces fit together perfectly. Arkard had studied his weapon of choice like a scholar, learning exactly how much insulin would kill, how to inject it to minimize bruising, how to time the doses to maximize suffering while maintaining plausible deniability. He turned murder into a science. The defense tried valiantly to create reasonable doubt. They argued that insulin breaks down quickly in the body, making definitive proof of poisoning difficult. They suggested that the deaths could have been natural, that the patterns were coincidental, that the prosecution was engaged in a witch hunt against a man whose only crime was bad luck in relationships. The jury wasn't buying it. They'd seen the evidence. They'd heard the testimonies. They'd watched Arkard on the stand, his charm now seeming sinister rather than appealing, his smooth explanations ringing hollow against the mountain of evidence. On October 23, 1978, after deliberating for 5 days, the jury returned guilty verdicts on multiple counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted. Family members of victims wept. Arkard sat motionless, his face a mask of disbelief. He'd been so certain of his invincibility, so convinced that his intelligence would save him. Even now, confronted with the jury's verdict, he couldn't quite process that he'd lost. The sentencing phase brought even more revelations. Prosecutors presented evidence of additional suspected murders that hadn't been part of the trial, bringing the total body count to at least 7 confirmed victims and possibly as many as 10 or more that could never be definitively proven. They argued that Arkard represented an unprecedented danger to society, a serial killer who'd operated successfully for 4 decades, who'd shown no remorse, no conscience, no recognition that his victims were human beings rather than profit opportunities. On January 23, 1979, Judge Bernard S. Jefferson sentenced William Dale Arkard to death in California's gas chamber. Reading the sentence, Judge Jefferson called Arkard one of the most dangerous killers in California history, noting that his crimes were particularly heinous because they'd been committed through systematic betrayal of trust over an extended period. Arkard was transferred to San Quentin State Prison to await execution. But California's death penalty jurisprudence was entering a period of turmoil, with legal challenges creating a de facto moratorium on executions. Arkard would never face the gas chamber. Instead, he'd spend the rest of his life in prison, aging slowly, his charm fading, his body failing in ways he'd inflicted on so many others. He filed appeals, claiming ineffective counsel, arguing prosecutorial misconduct, insisting he was innocent despite overwhelming evidence. Every appeal was denied. The courts had spoken. William Dale Arkard was a serial killer, and he would die in prison. What drove him? Psychologists who examined Arkard diagnosed him as a textbook psychopath, someone completely lacking in empathy, viewing other human beings as objects to be manipulated for personal gain. He had no emotional connection to his victims. When asked about the people he'd killed, he spoke about them with cold detachment, as if discussing failed business ventures rather than murdered human beings. Some experts suggested that Arkard's motivation was purely financial. He'd simply found an efficient way to make money and saw no moral reason not to exploit it. Others argued there was a deeper psychological component, that Arkard derived satisfaction from the act of fooling people, from the power of holding life and death in his hands, from the godlike ability to decide who lived and died. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Arkard was a man who discovered early that he could manipulate people, that his charm was a weapon, that trust was something to be exploited rather than honored. Over decades, he refined this exploitation into murder, crossing moral lines so gradually that perhaps he never quite recognized he'd become a monster. Or perhaps he recognized it and simply didn't care. On May 16, 1997, William Dale Arkard died in prison at the age of 85. He never expressed remorse for his crimes. He never apologized to the families of his victims. He went to his grave insisting he'd been wrongly convicted, a victim of circumstantial evidence and prosecutorial overreach. His death closed one of the longest-running serial murder cases in American criminal history, a 40-year reign of terror conducted not with guns or knives, but with insulin, charm, and an absolute absence of human conscience. The legacy of William Dale Arkard extends beyond his victims. His case changed how medical examiners approach suspicious deaths, particularly when insurance policies are involved. It led to improved protocols for detecting insulin poisoning and better cooperation between insurance investigators and law enforcement. It demonstrated that serial killers don't always fit the profile of the crazed lunatic. Sometimes they're the charming friend, the devoted husband, the helpful neighbor who stands at your bedside while poison floods your veins. Frank Stewart Sr., S. nephew, whose suspicions started the investigation that finally brought Arkard to justice, later said, "The scariest thing about Bill Arkard wasn't that he killed people. It was how normal he seemed. If my uncle hadn't taken out that insurance policy at just the right time, if I hadn't been paying attention, Arkard would still be out there, still killing, still getting away with it." He proved that the monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they're sitting across from you at dinner, smiling, and planning your funeral. The bodies of at least 7 people, Mary Brinker Post, Bernie Arkard, Letitia Cody, Frank Stewart Sr., and others whose names are lost to incomplete records, stand as testament to what happens when intelligence, charm, and complete moral vacancy combine in a single human being. William Dale Arkard wasn't insane. He wasn't hearing voices. He wasn't driven by uncontrollable rage. He was simply a man who decided that other people's lives were worth less than his financial comfort, and who spent 4 decades proving just how easy it is to kill when you understand both medicine and human nature. The needle is one of medicine's greatest tools, delivering insulin to diabetics, vaccines to children, antibiotics to the sick. In Arkard's hands, it became an instrument of silent, invisible death. His victims trusted him with their lives, and he repaid that trust with calculated murder. That's the final, terrifying truth about William Dale Arkard. He proved that the greatest danger often comes not from the stranger lurking in the darkness, but from the familiar face offering help, holding your hand, and carefully measuring out your death one calculated dose at a time. Sleep well tonight, knowing that monsters like Arkard don't announce themselves. They smile, they help, they care. And they kill with the patience of someone who knows that trust, once established, can be weaponized in ways more lethal than any gun. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Poison Widow of Windsor. She promised them peace in their final years. Instead, she fed them arsenic and cashed their checks. We're diving into the mind of a woman who turned a rest home into a graveyard, where the caretaker became the undertaker, and trust was the deadliest prescription of all. The Archer Home for Elderly People and Chronic Invalids stood like a monument to mercy on Prospect Street in Windsor, Connecticut. Its white clapboard exterior gleamed in the New England sun, surrounded by manicured gardens where roses climbed trellises and butterflies danced between hydrangea blooms. Passers-by would pause to admire the tranquil scene. Elderly residents rocking on the wide front porch, knitting needles clicking, glasses of lemonade sweating in the afternoon heat. Everything about the place whispered safety, comfort, and dignity. But beneath those floorboards, beneath the pleasant facade of afternoon teas and Sunday prayers, Something monstrous was growing. Amy Archer Gilligan arrived in Windsor in 1907 with her husband James and a dream that seemed almost noble. She wanted to create a sanctuary for the elderly, a place where people could spend their remaining days surrounded by kindness rather than neglect. At 37 years old, Amy possessed the kind of face that inspired confidence. Soft features, gentle eyes, a warm smile that seemed incapable of deception. She spoke in soothing tones about her vision for the home, about treating each resident like family, about providing care that went beyond mere obligation. The people of Windsor embraced her vision enthusiastically. Here was a woman of apparent compassion opening her doors to society's most vulnerable. The Archer home quickly filled with residents, most of them elderly individuals whose families paid handsomely for the promise of dignified care. Some paid a lump sum, anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500, for lifetime care, a small fortune in the early 1900s. Others paid monthly fees, trusting that Amy's gentle demeanor reflected the quality of attention their loved ones would receive. For the first few years, everything seemed legitimate. Residents appeared content. They wrote letters home describing adequate meals, clean rooms, and Amy's attentive nature. She attended to their needs personally, administering medications, preparing special meals for those with delicate constitutions, sitting beside bedsides during illness. When residents passed away, as elderly people inevitably do, Amy arranged funerals with apparent sorrow, often weeping at gravesides, her hand pressed dramatically to her chest. But death came to the Archer home with unusual frequency. James Archer, Amy's husband and co-founder of the home, died suddenly in 1910. The official cause was kidney disease, though he'd shown no prior symptoms of serious illness. Amy mourned publicly, draping herself in black, speaking tearfully about her loss. Yet within months, she'd married Michael Gilligan, a widower who'd been prospecting in Alaska. The marriage raised a few eyebrows among Windsor's gossips. The haste seemed improper, but most dismissed their concerns as small-town prudishness. Michael Gilligan didn't last long either. Less than 3 months after the wedding, he collapsed during dinner, writhing in agony, clutching his stomach as violent spasms tore through his body. A doctor was summoned, but Michael died before morning, his face twisted in a rictus of pain. The doctor attributed his death to acute indigestion, perhaps food poisoning. Amy wept appropriately, donned her widow's weeds once more, and returned to running the home alone. The deaths continued with metronome regularity. Franklin Andrews arrived at the Archer home in excellent health for a man of 68. A retired businessman with a comfortable pension, he'd paid Amy $1,500 for lifetime care, a sum that would provide security for his remaining years, however long those might be. Franklin had no serious illnesses, no chronic conditions. His family visited regularly, always finding him in good spirits, enjoying the home's amenities, praising Mrs. Gilligan's excellent care. 5 weeks after his arrival, Franklin was dead. The official cause was gastric distress, followed by heart failure. His family grieved but didn't question the explanation. Old people died. That was the natural order. They thanked Amy for her kindness during Franklin's final weeks and departed, leaving their loved one buried in Windsor Cemetery. Maud Lynch paid $1,200 for lifetime care. She lasted 6 weeks before mysterious stomach ailments claimed her life. Alice Gowdy, a sprightly 72-year-old who'd walked into the Archer home under her own power, died within 2 months of arrival. Cause of death: bilious fever. Charles Smith, age 65 and robust, paid his lump sum and expired 5 weeks later. Heart failure, the doctor wrote on the death certificate. The pattern should have been obvious. Healthy elderly people arrived at the Archer home, paid substantial sums for lifetime care, then died within weeks or months, long before their natural time, certainly long before their paid for lifetime should have expired. Each death meant Amy could pocket the remaining value of their contracts. Each funeral cleared a bed for a new paying customer. But patterns only become visible when someone chooses to look. Windsor's undertaker, a man named Frank Hodges, began noticing something disturbing. He'd handled funerals for the Archer home residents for years, and the frequency had increased dramatically. In 1911 alone, he'd buried 12 people from that address. 12 people from a home that housed, at most, 20 residents at any given time. The mortality rate was staggering, unprecedented. Hodges mentioned his concerns to others in town. Most dismissed him. Death came for the elderly. That was God's will. The Archer home attracted people in their final years. Naturally, they would die there. Besides, Mrs. Gilligan was such a kind woman, so devoted to her residents. The suggestion that something sinister lurked in her care bordered on slander. But Hodges couldn't shake his unease. He'd seen the bodies, prepared them for burial. Many showed signs of violent illness, the kind of suffering that seemed excessive even for natural death in old age. Faces contorted, bodies twisted, evidence of extreme gastrointestinal distress written in their final expressions. He began keeping records, noting each death from the Archer home, recording ages and circumstances. The documentation grew thicker month by month, a ledger of mortality that defied statistical probability. Meanwhile, Amy continued her charade with remarkable boldness. She attended church regularly, presenting herself as a pillar of the community. She joined women's societies, contributed to charitable causes, spoke eloquently about the sacred duty of caring for the elderly. Her public persona was unassailable. The devoted widow who'd sacrificed personal happiness to serve society's most vulnerable members. Behind closed doors, she was developing her murder technique into an art form. Arsenic became her weapon of choice. She could purchase it easily from local pharmacies, claiming she needed it for pest control around the home. Rats were a constant problem in old houses, she'd explain with an embarrassed smile. The pharmacists would nod sympathetically and sell her the poison without question. Arsenic was ubiquitous in the early 20th century, used for everything from wallpaper dye to cosmetics. Its availability made it the perfect murder weapon. Amy administered the poison carefully, methodically. Small doses mixed into food or medicine produced symptoms that mimicked natural illness. Stomach pain, vomiting, diarrhea, weakness. Doctors of that era had limited diagnostic tools. They relied heavily on visible symptoms and patient history. When Amy reported that a resident had been suffering from digestive troubles, had been weak and declining, physicians accepted her accounts without suspicion. She was, after all, the professional caregiver. She was their day and night. She would know. The genius of her method lay in its gradual application. A sudden death might raise suspicions, but slow decline followed by death seemed natural, expected. She'd nurse her victims through days or weeks of increasing illness, playing the concerned caretaker while actually orchestrating their demise. She'd sit beside their beds, holding their hands, speaking soothing words as the poison ravaged their internal organs. She'd summon doctors when the end approached, ensuring medical professionals witnessed the final stages and could provide death certificates without hesitation. And when they finally expired, she'd weep convincingly at their funerals before returning home to count her profits. The money accumulated quickly. Each lump sum payment that ended after mere weeks represented nearly pure profit. The cost of housing and feeding an elderly person for a month or two barely dented the $1,000 lifetime care fees. Amy grew wealthier with each death, purchasing property, investing in stocks, accumulating the kind of financial security most people could only dream of achieving. But wealth bred carelessness, and carelessness would eventually breed exposure. Nellie Pierce trusted Amy Archer Gilligan completely. Her sister Loren had lived at the Archer home, and when Loren died in 1914, Nellie had no reason to suspect foul play. Old age claimed everyone eventually, but something nagged at her consciousness, a splinter of doubt she couldn't quite extract. Loren had been healthy before entering the home. Not robust perhaps, but stable, managing her own affairs, mentally sharp. Then, within weeks of arrival, mysterious illnesses had plagued her. Stomach troubles, weakness, confusion. Amy had been attentive, Loren reported in her final letters, constantly bringing special foods and tonics to help with the ailments. But Loren had only grown worse, declining rapidly until death claimed her. The speed of it troubled Nellie. She'd seen elderly relatives decline before, but never with such velocity. Never with such violence. Lauren's final days had been agonizing, her body racked with pains that seemed excessive even for end-stage illness. Nellie began asking questions around Windsor. Had anyone else noticed the unusual death rate at the Archer home? Did other families share her vague suspicions? She discovered she wasn't alone in her concerns. Other relatives harbored similar doubts, though most kept them private, unwilling to voice accusations against a respected community member. But whispers were growing louder. A local newspaper editor named Clifton Sherman had been hearing rumors for years. Frank Hodges, the undertaker, had shared his mortality statistics. Other townspeople had mentioned their unease about the home's death rate. Sherman decided to investigate, though he proceeded cautiously. Accusing a prominent citizen of murder without evidence could destroy his newspaper and his reputation. He began collecting data systematically. Death certificates, burial records, witness statements. The numbers told a horrifying story. Between 1911 and 1916, at least 48 people had died at the Archer home, an average of 8 deaths per year in a facility that housed roughly 15 to 20 residents at any time. The mathematics were damning. If the home maintained an average population of 17 residents, losing 8 per year meant nearly half the population died annually. The mortality rate exceeded any comparable facility in Connecticut by catastrophic margins. Sherman published his findings in May 1916. The headline screamed across the front page, "Murder Factory. Have 40 or 50 people been killed for money in a Connecticut home?" The article ignited a firestorm. Windsor's comfortable denial shattered. Residents who'd dismissed concerns as gossip now confronted undeniable statistics. Families who'd buried loved ones from the Archer home began demanding answers. The peaceful facade of Prospect Street crumbled, revealing the charnel house that had operated in plain sight. State officials had no choice but to act. The Connecticut State's Attorney opened an investigation, bringing in experts to examine the mounting evidence. They ordered exhumations, a decision that sent shockwaves through Windsor's cemeteries. The first exhumation targeted Franklin Andrews, the healthy 68-year-old who died 5 weeks after paying $1,500 for lifetime care. His body had been buried for 4 years, but arsenic doesn't decay. Preserves. When toxicologists analyzed tissue samples from Franklin's remains, they found lethal concentrations of arsenic throughout his organs. The poison had saturated his liver, his kidneys, his stomach lining. This wasn't accidental exposure or medicinal use. This was murder, deliberate and methodical. More bodies were disinterred from Windsor's soil. More corpses revealed their poison secrets. Alice Gowdy, arsenic. Charles Smith, arsenic. Maud Lynch, arsenic. The earth gave up its dead, and every grave told the same story. Amy Archer Gilligan was arrested on May 8, 1916, charged with murder. Officers found her at the home, calmly going about her daily routine as if the world hadn't just discovered her monstrous crimes. She protested her innocence with theatrical outrage, claiming persecution, insisting that some terrible mistake had been made. But the evidence was insurmountable. Investigators searching the Archer home discovered Amy's poison cache, bottles of arsenic stored in her private quarters, far more than any legitimate pest control would require. They found ledgers documenting her financial gains, showing how each death had enriched her coffers. They interviewed residents who'd survived, elderly men and women who described mysterious illnesses that had struck them shortly after arriving, illnesses that disappeared after family members moved them elsewhere. The most damning evidence came from pharmacy records. Investigators traced Amy's arsenic purchases over several years, documenting dozens of transactions. She'd bought enough poison to exterminate every rat in Connecticut 10 times over. The quantities correlated perfectly with the timeline of deaths at her facility. One particular victim's story captured public attention with its tragic irony. Michael Gilligan, Amy's second husband, had been a strong, healthy man when he married her. He'd survived years of harsh Alaska winters, had worked physically demanding jobs, had shown no signs of illness. Yet within 3 months of marrying Amy, he was dead, killed by the same stomach ailments that had claimed so many of her residents. Amy had murdered her own husband for his money and property. The revelation horrified even hardened investigators. This wasn't simply greed driving her to kill vulnerable strangers. She'd looked into the eyes of a man she'd married, spoken wedding vows with him, shared a bed with him, then methodically poisoned him for profit. The coldness required for such an act suggested something beyond ordinary criminality. This was pathology, a fundamental absence of human empathy. As the investigation deepened, a profile of Amy Archer Gilligan emerged that challenged everything Windsor thought they knew about her. The gentle caretaker had been a carefully constructed mask. Behind it lurked a predator of extraordinary cunning and ruthlessness. Former employees came forward with disturbing stories. They described how Amy would isolate certain residents, preventing visitors, controlling all their interactions. She'd claim they were too ill for company, that excitement might worsen their conditions. In reality, she was preventing witnesses from observing the poisoning process. Isolated victims couldn't report their symptoms to concerned relatives. They couldn't describe how Mrs. Gilligan's special meals and tonics always preceded their worst suffering. One nurse recalled asking Amy about the high death rate. Amy had laughed, and said, "We're in the death business. Death is good for business." The nurse had dismissed it as dark humor at the time, a grim joke about the realities of elder care. Now those words took on sinister meaning. Amy had viewed her residents not as human beings deserving care and dignity, but as financial assets to be liquidated. Each elderly person who walked through her door represented potential profit. The faster they died, the sooner she could admit a new paying customer. She'd industrialized murder, turning her home into an assembly line of death where compassion was replaced by calculation. The prosecution built their case methodically, knowing they faced an uphill battle. Circumstantial evidence abounded, but securing a conviction for multiple murders required ironclad proof. They chose to prosecute her for a single murder initially, that of Franklin Andrews, using his case as the strongest example of her method and motive. The trial began in June 1917, more than a year after Amy's arrest. Windsor's courthouse overflowed with spectators, journalists crowding the gallery, sketching the defendant for newspapers across the nation. Amy sat calmly at the defense table, dressed in somber black, her face arranged in an expression of wounded innocence. She played the role of persecuted widow to perfection, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, shaking her head sorrowfully as prosecutors described her crimes. But the evidence demolished her performance. Expert witnesses testified about the arsenic found in Franklin Andrews's remains. Pharmacists described Amy's excessive poison purchases. Former residents recounted their mysterious illnesses and narrow escapes. The financial records showed her motive with mathematical precision. Franklin had paid $1,500 for lifetime care, but had only consumed a few weeks' worth of services before dying. Amy had pocketed the difference, essentially earning $1,500 for murdering an innocent man. The defense tried desperately to create reasonable doubt. Perhaps Franklin had consumed arsenic accidentally. Perhaps he'd taken it medicinally. Some people used arsenic compounds for various ailments. Perhaps someone else at the home had administered the poison. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming. Too many victims, too much poison, too clear a pattern. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning their verdict. Guilty of murder in the first degree. The judge sentenced Amy Archer Gilligan to death by hanging. Connecticut law demanded the ultimate penalty for first-degree murder, and the court saw no reason for leniency. She would be the first woman executed by the state in decades, a distinction that generated both satisfaction and controversy. Amy's mask finally slipped when she heard the sentence. The gentle widow persona evaporated, replaced by raw fury. She screamed at the judge, at the jury, at the courtroom gallery. She cursed prosecutors, threatened witnesses, revealed the rage that had simmered beneath her pleasant exterior all along. Guards had to physically restrain her as she was removed from the courtroom, her shrieks echoing through the halls. But Amy Archer Gilligan possessed one final weapon, The legal system's complexity. Her attorneys immediately filed appeals, arguing technical errors in the trial, challenging evidence admissibility, raising every possible objection to overturn the conviction. The appeals process crawled forward at glacial pace, keeping Amy alive in her cell while lawyers debated procedural minutiae. Public opinion remained divided. Many demanded swift execution, viewing Amy as a monster who'd betrayed the most fundamental human trust. She'd taken money to care for vulnerable people, then murdered them for profit. What crime could be more heinous? She deserved no mercy, no second chances, no sympathy. Others, however, questioned her sanity. Could any truly rational person commit such crimes? Didn't the sheer scale of her murders suggest mental illness rather than evil? Psychiatrists examined Amy, looking for signs of insanity that might spare her from the gallows. What they found was chilling. Amy showed no remorse whatsoever. She expressed no empathy for her victims, no understanding that she'd done anything wrong. When psychiatrists pressed her about the murders, she became indignant, insisting she'd been a devoted caretaker who'd done nothing but serve her community. The cognitive dissonance was breathtaking. Faced with overwhelming evidence of her crimes, she still maintained her innocent facade, seemingly believing her own lies. Some psychiatrists diagnosed her as suffering from moral insanity, a 19th century concept describing people who understood right from wrong intellectually but felt no emotional attachment to moral behavior. Today, we might recognize her as a psychopath, someone lacking conscience, incapable of genuine empathy, viewing other humans as objects to be manipulated for personal gain. But moral insanity wasn't grounds for legal insanity under Connecticut law. To avoid execution, Amy needed to demonstrate she didn't understand the nature of her acts or couldn't distinguish right from wrong. Her behavior showed she understood perfectly. She'd hidden her crimes carefully, maintained an elaborate public persona, destroyed evidence, lied systematically. These weren't the actions of someone disconnected from reality. These were the calculated moves of a predator who knew exactly what she was doing. The appeals dragged on for years. Amy remained imprisoned while lawyers filed motion after motion, each delay extending her life a few months more. The death house at Connecticut State Prison became her world, a small cell where she awaited her fate with alternating episodes of rage and manipulation. She granted interviews to newspapers, playing the victim card with shameless dedication. She claimed she was innocent, framed by conspirators jealous of her success. She insisted the evidence had been fabricated, that Windsor's officials had persecuted her because she was a woman operating a successful business. She wept dramatically for journalists' cameras, presenting herself as a martyr to prejudice and injustice. Some people believed her. Her case attracted supporters who viewed her conviction as an example of how women were treated unfairly by male-dominated legal systems. They organized letter-writing campaigns, petitioned the governor for clemency, raised funds for her continued appeals. But most people saw through her performance. The evidence was too strong, the pattern too clear. Amy Archer Gilligan had murdered dozens of elderly people for money. No amount of tears or protestations could change that fundamental truth. In 1919, Connecticut's Supreme Court upheld her conviction but granted a new trial on technical grounds. The prosecution prepared to try her again, but this time they made a strategic decision. Rather than pursue the death penalty, they'd accept a plea to second-degree murder, which carried a sentence of life imprisonment. Why the change? Several factors influenced the decision. The years of appeals had cost taxpayers enormous sums. Another lengthy trial would cost even more. Additionally, public appetite for executing a woman, even one guilty of such horrific crimes, had waned. Life imprisonment seemed sufficient punishment, and it avoided the controversy of hanging a female defendant. Amy accepted the plea deal in 1919. She was sentenced to life in prison at Connecticut State Prison for Women, trading the death house for a different kind of permanent confinement. The question of her total victim count remained unanswered. Prosecutors had proven she murdered Franklin Andrews. Strong evidence suggested she'd also killed at least 4 others whose bodies contained lethal arsenic levels. But how many others had she murdered whose remains weren't exhumed? How many victims had been cremated, their evidence destroyed? How many deaths attributed to natural causes were actually poisonings? Conservative estimates placed her victim count at least 5. More realistic assessments suggested 20 or more. Some investigators believed the number might exceed 40. Nearly every death at the Archer home during her tenure. If the higher estimates were accurate, Amy Archer Gilligan would rank among the most prolific serial killers in American history. She'd operated a murder factory disguised as a care facility, systematically killing vulnerable people for profit over at least 5 years. The death toll rivaled some of history's most notorious killers, yet she'd operated with impunity in a small Connecticut town, trusted by the community, protected by her facade of respectability. Inside prison, Amy's behavior remained disturbing. She showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of guilt, no empathy for the families she'd destroyed. She complained constantly about her treatment, demanded special privileges, acted as if she were the victim of some terrible injustice. Guards described her as manipulative and difficult, constantly trying to charm or intimidate them into giving her advantages. As years passed, her mental state deteriorated. Whether genuine illness or calculated performance remained unclear, but Amy began exhibiting signs of dementia. She'd wander the prison halls confused, forget where she was, fail to recognize people she'd known for years. The sharp intelligence that had orchestrated so many murders seemed to fade, replaced by increasing incoherence. In 1924, prison officials transferred her to Connecticut Valley Hospital for the insane, determining she'd become too mentally impaired for regular incarceration. She spent her remaining years in the psychiatric facility, a shuffling ghost of the calculating killer who'd once terrorized Windsor's elderly population. Amy Archer Gilligan died on April 23, 1962, at age 93. The woman who'd cut short so many lives had ironically lived to extreme old age herself, surviving in confinement for more than 4 decades after her final murder. Death came from natural causes. The peaceful end her victims had been denied. Her passing received minimal news coverage. By 1962, few people remembered the Archer home murders. The case had faded from public consciousness, replaced by newer horrors and more recent scandals. Amy died in obscurity, mourned by no one, her grave unmarked. But her legacy lingered in the scars she'd left on families and in the cautionary lessons her case provided. The Archer home for elderly people closed immediately after Amy's arrest in 1916. Surviving residents were relocated to other facilities, and the building itself stood empty for years, a haunted monument to the crimes committed within its walls. Locals avoided Prospect Street, crossing to the opposite sidewalk rather than pass too close to the murder house. Children whispered about ghosts, about vengeful spirits of poisoned victims wandering the abandoned rooms. Eventually, the property was sold and repurposed, its dark history gradually forgotten by new generations. Today, few residents of Windsor remember what happened there. The building itself has been demolished or altered beyond recognition. Only local historians recall that Prospect Street once housed one of America's deadliest serial killers. But Amy Archer Gilligan's crimes raised questions that remain relevant more than a century later. How did she operate undetected for so long? What failures of oversight, regulation, and community vigilance allowed her to murder dozens of vulnerable people? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about society's blind spots. Amy succeeded partly because she fit no one's image of a killer. Early 20th century America couldn't conceive of a gentle widow as a predatory murderer. Women were supposed to be nurturing, compassionate, naturally suited for caregiving roles. The possibility that a woman might exploit those expectations to facilitate murder simply didn't occur to most people. This gender bias protected Amy. When Undertaker Frank Hodges raised concerns about the death rate, many dismissed him as gossipy or paranoid. How dare he question Mrs. Gilligan's character? She was a respectable woman performing Christian charity. The suggestion that she might be murdering her residents seemed absurd, offensive even. Modern criminology recognizes that female serial killers often exploit precisely these stereotypes. They choose methods that appear natural: poison, suffocation, medical neglect. They select vulnerable victims unlikely to be missed or carefully investigated. They operate in caregiving roles where their access to victims seems legitimate and their explanations for deaths are readily accepted. Amy pioneered these techniques, though she certainly wasn't the first female serial killer. History contains numerous examples of women who murdered systematically. Servants who poisoned employers, wives who killed husbands, nurses who ended patients' lives. But Amy's scale and audacity distinguished her crimes. She didn't kill in passion or desperation. She created a systematic murder operation, industrializing death for profit. The regulatory failures that enabled her crimes were equally significant. The Archer home operated without meaningful oversight. No state agency inspected elder care facilities. No licensing board verified caregivers' qualifications. No regular audits tracked resident mortality rates. Amy faced no external scrutiny whatsoever. She could murder with impunity because no one was watching. This lack of regulation reflected broader societal attitudes about elder care in the early 1900s. Elderly people were often viewed as burdens, warehoused in facilities with minimal concern for their treatment. Families paid for care, then largely forgot about their aging relatives, trusting that institutions would manage them appropriately. This neglect created perfect conditions for predators like Amy. Her case directly inspired reform. Connecticut established licensing requirements for care facilities, mandatory inspections, mortality reporting requirements. Other states followed suit, creating regulatory frameworks designed to prevent similar abuses. Amy Archer Gilligan's murders became the catalyst for protecting vulnerable elderly people through governmental oversight. But enforcement remained imperfect. Throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, cases of elder abuse in care facilities continued surfacing. Predatory caregivers still exploit vulnerable victims, though rarely on Amy's industrial scale. The regulatory systems inspired by her crimes provide some protection, but they can't eliminate human evil entirely. Amy's case also highlighted society's complicated relationship with aging and death. Why had Windsor's residents not questioned the high death rate sooner? Partly because death among elderly people seemed natural, expected, almost inevitable. The Archer home housed old people. Of course they died there. This assumption provided Amy perfect cover. Modern geriatrics recognizes that age alone doesn't make death inevitable in the short term. A healthy 70-year-old can reasonably expect decades more life. The elderly aren't uniformly fragile and dying. They're individuals with varied health statuses, many of whom will live years or decades beyond the age Amy's victims reached. But in 1910, such understanding was less common. Old age itself was viewed as a fatal condition, a slow decline toward inevitable death. This perception allowed Amy to murder people who might have lived years longer without her intervention. The financial structure of her operation also revealed dark truths about how society values elderly lives. The lump-sum lifetime care model created perverse incentives. Amy profited maximally when residents died quickly, before consuming the value of their payments. Every additional day a resident lived reduced her profit margin. The business model literally incentivized murder. Modern elder care facilities typically charge monthly rather than lump-sum fees, partly to avoid these perverse incentives. But even monthly fee structures can create problems when facilities prioritize profit over care. Amy's case serves as a stark reminder that commodifying care for vulnerable people creates dangerous dynamics requiring constant vigilance. Psychologically, Amy Archer Gilligan remains fascinating and disturbing. How did she maintain her facade so successfully? How did she compartmentalize her crimes while presenting a face of compassion to the world? The answer likely lies in her complete lack of empathy. For Amy, residents weren't people with hopes, fears, families, and histories. They were revenue sources, problems to be managed, obstacles between her and wealth. This dehumanization allowed her to poison them without emotional burden. She felt no guilt because she genuinely didn't perceive them as fully human. This capacity for dehumanization isn't unique to Amy. It appears throughout history wherever atrocities occur. Slave traders, concentration camp guards, genocidal killers, All share this ability to view certain humans as less than human, as objects rather than people. Amy simply applied this dehumanization in service of personal profit rather than ideology. Her ability to deceive also suggests sophisticated manipulation skills. She understood social expectations and performed them flawlessly. She cried at funerals because that's what people expected. She spoke compassionately about care because that's what people wanted to hear. She attended church and joined civic organizations because those activities burnished her reputation. Every aspect of her public persona was calculated performance designed to deflect suspicion. Even when finally exposed, she maintained her manipulative tactics. Her protestations of innocence, her theatrical displays of emotion, her attempts to play the victim, all were strategies to avoid consequences. She never genuinely acknowledged her crimes because doing so served no purpose for her. Remorse requires empathy, and Amy possessed none. Forensic psychology would love to study Amy Archer Gilligan's brain. What neurological factors contributed to her psychopathy? Were there genetic predispositions toward her lack of empathy? Did childhood experiences shape her into a killer, or was she born with fundamental emotional deficits? These questions remain unanswered. Amy died before modern neuroimaging could examine her brain structure. No detailed psychological profile exists from her era. We're left speculating about the origins of her monstrosity based on limited evidence. What we know with certainty is that she represents a particular type of killer, the angel of death who murders those in their care. This category includes healthcare workers who kill patients, caregivers who murder vulnerable charges, trusted individuals who exploit their positions for deadly purposes. Amy wasn't the first angel of death, and she certainly wasn't the last. Throughout history, similar cases surface regularly. Nurses who inject patients with lethal drugs, home health aides who suffocate elderly clients, care facility workers who hasten deaths through neglect or active harm. These killers share common characteristics: access to vulnerable victims, positions of trust that deflect suspicion, methods that mimic natural death, and psychological profiles suggesting psychopathy or extreme narcissism. Amy Archer Gilligan fit this pattern perfectly. Her case also intersects with broader themes about women and violence. Society often struggles to acknowledge female violence, particularly when women use covert methods like poison. The stereotype of the nurturing woman conflicts with the reality that some women are fully capable of calculated, brutal violence. Amy challenged these stereotypes a century ago, yet society still sometimes fails to recognize female predators. Women who abuse children, who murder intimate partners, who kill systematically, all exploit the assumption that women aren't really dangerous. Amy proved that assumption deadly wrong. For the families of Amy's victims, her conviction and imprisonment provided minimal comfort. Justice came too late for their loved ones. The people they'd entrusted to Amy's care had suffered agonizing deaths, betrayed by the woman they'd paid to protect them. No legal outcome could restore their lives or erase the horror of their final days. Some families never learned the truth. Relatives who'd buried loved ones before Amy's exposure never knew their family members had been murdered. They lived and died believing natural illness had claimed people actually killed by arsenic. Amy's full victim count will forever remain uncertain because so many deaths went uninvestigated. The Windsor community itself struggled with collective shame and trauma. They'd embraced Amy, trusted her, praised her charitable work. They'd ignored warning signs, dismissed concerns, enabled her crimes through willful blindness. Coming to terms with this failure challenged their self-perception as vigilant, caring community members. But from that trauma came determination. Windsor residents became advocates for elder care reform, supporting legislation to prevent similar tragedies. They transformed their community's dark chapter into motivation for positive change, ensuring Amy's victims hadn't died completely in vain. Today, the Archer home murders remain a cautionary tale taught in criminology courses, discussed in true crime literature, examined by students of serial murder. Amy Archer Gilligan's name appears alongside other notorious killers as an example of how trust can be weaponized, how society's blind spots enable predators, and how evil sometimes wears the most innocent faces. The elderly residents who walked into her home seeking peace in their final years found something far different. A predator who saw them only as profit opportunities, who valued their bank accounts more than their lives, who betrayed the fundamental human compact between caregiver and vulnerable person. Amy's story reminds us that monsters don't always announce themselves with obvious menace. Sometimes they smile kindly, speak soothingly, and offer help to those most desperate for care. Sometimes evil operates not through dramatic violence but through quiet poisoning, through patient calculation, through systematic exploitation of trust. The White House on Prospect Street stood as a warning that still resonates. The most dangerous predators often hide behind masks of compassion, and society's most vulnerable people require constant protection from those who would exploit them. Amy Archer Gilligan may be long dead, but her legacy lives in the regulations that protect elders, in the vigilance communities maintained toward care facilities, and in the understanding that evil recognizes no gender and respects no trust. The monster hunted in broad daylight, and for too long, no one stopped her. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4, The Vanishing. Roberto Argels and the Nightmare That Never Ended. A father's smile concealed something unimaginable, until the day his children became ghosts. What begins as a custody dispute transforms into every parent's darkest fear made flesh. We're tracking a predator tonight, but this predator wore the disguise of protector. Roberto Argels didn't lurk in shadows or stalk strangers. He had something far more sinister: legal access to his prey. In the suffocating heat of a California summer, two innocent souls walked into their father's arms and vanished from the face of the earth. What followed wasn't just a disappearance. It was calculated erasure, a methodical obliteration of two young lives that would haunt investigators for decades. The question isn't whether evil exists. The question is how evil can hide behind a father's face, signing custody papers with the same hands that would commit the unthinkable. The disintegration of a marriage rarely announces itself with clarity. Instead, it creeps through a household like carbon monoxide, invisible, odorless, lethal. For Roberto Argels and his wife, their union didn't explode in some dramatic confrontation worthy of tabloid headlines. It withered, slowly, deliberately, until what remained was nothing but a legal arrangement binding two people who'd become strangers sharing an address. Roberto Argels presented himself to the world as an ordinary man navigating an ordinary tragedy. Divorce, after all, had become an American epidemic by the late 20th century, touching nearly half of all marriages. But ordinary was precisely what Roberto was not. Behind the rehearsed expressions of disappointment and the carefully worded complaints about his estranged wife, something else stirred, something patient, calculating, and profoundly disturbed. His children, born into what must have once seemed like promise, now found themselves caught in the crossfire of a dissolution they couldn't possibly understand. A daughter and a son, their names withheld to protect whatever dignity remains in this horror story, became unwitting chess pieces in a game whose rules defied comprehension. They attended school, played with friends, celebrated birthdays, completely unaware that their father was transforming into something monstrous before their very eyes. The custody proceedings unfolded with agonizing predictability. Lawyers argued, paperwork accumulated, court dates stretched across months, then years. Roberto played his role with disturbing precision, the concerned father fighting for time with his children, the wounded husband seeking fairness in an unfair system. He showed up to hearings appropriately dressed, spoke with measured emotion, demonstrated what the courts interpreted as genuine paternal investment. Every checkbox marked, every requirement satisfied. What the legal system failed to detect was the meticulous nature of Roberto's planning. While other divorced fathers struggled with logistics, figuring out weekend visitation schedules, negotiating holiday arrangements, learning to cook meals their children would actually eat. Roberto was orchestrating something exponentially more sinister. The custody battle wasn't about maintaining a relationship with his children. It was about obtaining legitimate, court-sanctioned access to them. The mother sensed something wrong, the way animals sense earthquakes before the ground splits open. She couldn't articulate it in legal terms that would satisfy a judge's requirements for evidence. There were no bruises to photograph, no threatening messages to submit as exhibits, no witnesses to dramatic confrontations. Instead, she possessed only that ancient, primal intuition that screams warnings when words fail. Something about the way Roberto looked at the children. Something about his insistence on unsupervised visitation. Something about the questions he asked during exchanges. Too detailed, too probing, as though he were gathering intelligence rather than making conversation. She fought the custody arrangement with everything she possessed, but the system operated according to its own logic. Fathers had rights. Children needed both parents. Unless clear evidence of danger existed, courts defaulted to shared custody. Roberto's attorney presented him as a devoted father victimized by a vindictive ex-wife attempting parental alienation. The narrative worked. It always works because it sounds reasonable, and the legal system worships at the altar of reasonable appearances. The judge issued the order. Roberto Arguelles would have regular, unsupervised visitation with his children. Specific dates, specific times, legally binding arrangements that transformed into death warrants signed in judicial ink. The weeks leading up to that fateful visitation passed with excruciating normalcy. The children went to school. They did homework. They complained about vegetables at dinner and begged for extra screen time. Their mother watched them with an intensity that bordered on surveillance, memorizing details she didn't know she'd soon desperately need. The exact shade of her daughter's hair in afternoon sunlight, the particular way her son laughed at his own jokes, the weight of their bodies during goodnight hugs. Roberto maintained his facade with impressive discipline. He called when scheduled. He sent child support payments on time. He asked appropriate questions about grades and activities. To outside observers, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a father working to maintain connection with children he loved. But love was a word that had lost all meaning in Roberto's psychological landscape. What festered inside him bore no resemblance to paternal affection. Instead, a toxic combination of rage, entitlement, and something darker, something that defied simple psychological categorization, consumed whatever humanity he'd once possessed. The night before the scheduled visitation, the mother barely slept. She checked door locks repeatedly. She walked into her children's rooms every hour, watching them breathe in the darkness, memorizing the sound. Some instinct older than language screamed at her to run, to grab her children and disappear into the night, to become fugitives rather than comply with the court order. But where would they go? How would they survive? And wouldn't Roberto simply call the police, report a kidnapping, use the legal system itself to hunt them down? She was trapped in the nightmare that haunts every protective parent facing a family court system designed to facilitate access rather than prevent danger. The law, in its cold procedural efficiency, was about to feed her children to a monster. Morning arrived with cruel brightness. Sunshine that should have promised another ordinary day instead illuminated the path to catastrophe. The children dressed in their favorite clothes, small vanities of childhood that would later become unbearable details in missing persons reports. They ate breakfast, though the mother would later remember she couldn't recall what they consumed. Her mind had already begun the dissociative process that trauma victims know intimately, disconnecting from reality as a survival mechanism against what was coming. Roberto arrived precisely on time. Punctuality as performance. He knocked on the door with appropriate politeness. He greeted his children with smiles that reached his mouth but stopped dead in his eyes. The mother stood in the doorway, her body physically aching with the need to slam the door, to refuse, to violate the court order and damn the consequences. But fear of legal repercussions, fear of losing custody entirely if she didn't comply, fear of appearing as the unreasonable, vindictive ex-wife Roberto's attorney had painted her to be, all of it conspired to paralyze her. She handed her children over to their father. She watched them walk down the driveway, her daughter's hand in Roberto's left hand, her son clinging to his right. She watched Roberto open the car doors. She watched him buckle them into their seats with careful attention to safety, a detail that would later feel like mockery, securing children safely for a journey that would end in their destruction. She watched the car pull away from the curb. She stood in that doorway long after the vehicle disappeared from view, staring at empty street as though she could will their return through sheer force of maternal desperation. Hours passed. The agreed-upon return time came and went. The mother called Roberto's phone. No answer. She called again, straight to voicemail. She called his relatives. No one had heard from him. She called his friends. Same response. She called the police, though she already knew what they would say. They said it's a custody arrangement. He has legal right to the children. Wait 48 hours. He probably just extended the visit. Call if he doesn't return them tomorrow. But she knew, somewhere in the depths of her being, beneath conscious thought, in that ancient place where mothers have always known when their children face danger, she knew. Roberto Argels had taken his children, but he never intended to bring them back. The 48 hours the police insisted she wait transformed into an eternity compressed into seconds. Time lost all coherent meaning for the mother. Minutes stretched into hours that somehow simultaneously collapsed into moments. She existed in a state of suspended animation, every cell in her body screaming that something catastrophic had occurred, while the procedural machinery of law enforcement insisted on patience, on following protocol, on waiting. When the authorities finally acknowledged this as a legitimate missing persons case, the investigation that unfolded revealed the horrifying extent of Roberto's preparation. This wasn't an impulsive act of a father pushed to emotional extremes. This was premeditated, calculated, and executed with disturbing precision. Roberto Argels had been planning this disappearance for months, possibly years. While going through motions of custody negotiations, while sitting in courtrooms presenting himself as a reasonable parent seeking fair arrangements, he'd been methodically constructing an exit strategy designed to make himself and his children vanish completely. Financial investigators discovered Roberto had been slowly liquidating assets. Small withdrawals, nothing large enough to trigger banking alerts or raise suspicion, but accumulating to substantial sums. He'd opened accounts under variations of his name in different states. He'd purchased a vehicle with cash 3 months before the disappearance and registered it under a cousin's name, a cousin who would later claim complete ignorance of this arrangement. He'd applied for duplicate documents, obtaining second copies of birth certificates and social security cards through bureaucratic channels designed to help people replace lost paperwork, but which also served those seeking to establish new identities. Most chillingly, Roberto had been researching locations. His internet search history, later recovered by forensic specialists, painted a disturbing picture of his intentions. He'd looked up remote areas throughout the American Southwest. Desert regions where bodies could disappear forever beneath sand and sun. Mountain territories where abandoned mine shafts created natural graves. Border towns where crossing into Mexico offered the possibility of escaping American jurisdiction entirely. The ambiguity in his searches made them even more terrifying. Was he researching places to hide with his children, beginning a life on the run? Or was he researching places to hide his children's bodies after murdering them? This uncertainty would plague investigators for decades. Both scenarios seemed equally plausible, and the evidence supported either interpretation. Roberto could be a father who'd kidnapped his own children, keeping them alive in some isolated location, raising them under assumed names, convincing them their mother had abandoned them. Or he could be a family annihilator who'd murdered his children and disposed of their bodies with the same meticulous care he'd applied to planning the abduction. The search expanded rapidly. Local police coordinated with state authorities. The FBI became involved, classifying this as a parental kidnapping with possible interstate flight implications. Amber Alerts broadcast the children's photographs across the region. Media coverage intensified as the story gained traction. Photogenic children, a custody dispute turned nightmare, the universal fear among divorced parents that something similar could happen to their own families. Tips flooded in from across the country. Someone thought they saw a man matching Roberto's description at a gas station in Arizona. Another caller reported children resembling the missing siblings at a shopping mall in Nevada. A trucker claimed he'd picked up a hitchhiker who mentioned traveling with his kids to start fresh in Montana. Every lead demanded investigation, consuming thousands of hours of police work, and every lead ultimately terminated in dead ends. The most promising sighting occurred 2 weeks after the disappearance. A convenience store clerk in a small New Mexico town contacted authorities after seeing the Amber Alert. She insisted she'd served a man fitting Roberto's description 3 days prior. He'd been with 2 children who seemed quiet, withdrawn, not quite right. She'd noticed because the man kept rushing them, not letting them browse the candy aisle the way most fathers indulged their kids. She'd almost said something at the time, but convinced herself she was being paranoid. By the time police arrived, reviewed the store's security footage, and confirmed the man was indeed Roberto Argels, he'd vanished again. The footage showed him purchasing supplies, bottled water, non-perishable foods, first aid materials, but revealed nothing about where he was heading next. His vehicle, visible in the parking lot footage, still bore the license plates registered to his cousin. Tracking efforts began immediately, but Roberto had already moved on, leaving no trace. This pattern would repeat itself over the coming months. Brief sightings, confirmed identifications from security cameras or witnesses, followed by nothing. Roberto was traveling, but with no apparent destination. He zigzagged across the Southwest, never staying anywhere more than a day or two, always paying cash, avoiding interactions that might create memorable impressions. The children appeared in some of this footage, and these images became objects of obsessive analysis. Were they still alive? They appeared to be, visible in several security camera captures walking beside their father, getting in and out of vehicles. But appearances could be deceiving. The timestamps on the footage helped establish a timeline, but they also raised terrifying questions. The children looked increasingly pale, increasingly thin, increasingly absent even while physically present. Forensic psychologists studied the footage, analyzing body language and spatial relationships. The children stayed close to Roberto, never attempting to run or signal for help. Stockholm Syndrome, some suggested. They'd been conditioned to compliance through fear or manipulation. Others argued the children might not realize anything was wrong, that Roberto could be framing this as an adventure, a father-children bonding experience that would end when he'd made his point to their mother. But another possibility haunted every investigator involved in the case. The sightings might be chronologically misleading. Security camera timestamps could be incorrect. The children visible in this footage might already be dead, their images preserved only in digital recordings while their bodies decomposed somewhere in the desert. The mother existed in a state of suspended agony. She appeared on television, pleading for her children's return. She spoke at press conferences, her voice cracking as she addressed Roberto directly, begging him to do the right thing. She worked with age progression specialists who created computer-generated images showing what her children might look like years into the future if they were still alive, still growing, still aging somewhere out there. She became an expert in parental kidnapping, connecting with support groups of other parents navigating similar nightmares. She learned the statistics, how few parental kidnapping cases ended with children found alive and unharmed, how many simply became cold cases that never resolved, how some children weren't recovered for decades, eventually found as adults who'd lived entire lives under assumed identities, their memories of their original families erased or suppressed. Every police department in the Southwest received information about the case. Every Border Patrol agent carried copies of the Amber Alert. Every social worker who encountered children registered under suspicious circumstances received training to watch for these specific missing siblings. A nationwide network mobilized, but networks require nodes of connection, and Roberto Argels had become invisible. 6 months after the disappearance, the active search status changed. Police departments couldn't maintain intensive investigations indefinitely. Resources had limits. Other crimes demanded attention. The case remained open, technically active, but the daily briefings stopped. The task force disbanded. The media moved on to fresher tragedies. The mother refused to accept this transition. She hired private investigators, spending money she didn't have, chasing leads that police had already exhausted. She created websites dedicated to finding her children. She posted their pictures on every social media platform, begging for shares, for viral attention, for the internet's collective surveillance to succeed where traditional investigations had failed. Years accumulated. The children aged in computer-generated projections, but not in reality, at least not in any reality their mother could access. Birthdays passed, marked by vigils rather than celebrations. Holidays became torture sessions. Every news story about discovered remains sent terror through her body until DNA results confirmed these weren't her children. Other parents of missing children understood this specific hell, the absence of closure, the inability to grieve properly because grief requires accepting death, and death remained unconfirmed. She existed in limbo between hope and despair, neither able to mourn her children nor able to welcome them home. Roberto Argels had achieved something remarkably rare in an age of digital surveillance and interconnected databases. He disappeared completely, taking 2 children with him into whatever darkness he'd chosen. The question that haunted every investigator, every psychologist who studied the case, every person who learned this story, was simple and terrible. Were those children still alive somewhere, prisoners of their own father? Or had Roberto Argels murdered them shortly after the abduction, disposing of their bodies in one of the countless remote locations he'd researched, leaving a mother to suffer decades of unknowing? To understand Roberto Argels requires descending into psychological territories most people prefer to ignore. Family annihilators represent a specific, terrifying category of murderer, individuals who destroy the people they're supposedly biologically programmed to protect. Understanding this pathology demands abandoning comfortable assumptions about parental love and confronting the reality that monsters don't always hide in strangers' faces. Family annihilation typically follows predictable patterns, and Roberto's case, whether it involved murder or kidnapping, aligned disturbingly well with established profiles. These perpetrators share common characteristics: overwhelming narcissism, inability to tolerate perceived rejection, view of family members as possessions rather than autonomous individuals, and catastrophic emotional collapse when facing loss of control. The divorce wasn't just a legal dissolution of marriage for Roberto. It represented an intolerable narcissistic injury. Men like Roberto construct their identities around control and dominance within family structures. When wives leave, when courts divide assets, when custody arrangements get negotiated, these men experience existential threats to their fundamental self-concept. They don't grieve the loss of relationship. They rage against the loss of power. Psychologists call this proprietary thinking, the treatment of family members as property, as extensions of self rather than separate beings with their own rights and autonomy. In Roberto's warped psychology, his children weren't independent people who happened to be his offspring. They were his possessions, his creations, components of his identity that he controlled absolutely. When custody arrangements forced sharing of this control, when his ex-wife gained legal rights to time with their children, Roberto's psyche couldn't tolerate the arrangement. The solution his damaged mind generated was elegant in its horror. If he couldn't have exclusive control, then she couldn't have them at all. This type of thinking manifests in a chilling logic that makes perfect sense within the distorted reality family annihilators inhabit. They rationalize their actions through several overlapping justifications. First, the mercy-killing delusion, convincing themselves that death at a loving father's hands is preferable to life in a broken home. Second, the revenge fantasy, punishing the ex-spouse with the ultimate, irreversible harm. Third, the ownership prerogative, asserting that because they created these children, they possess absolute authority over their existence. Roberto's meticulous planning suggested he possessed more self-awareness than many family annihilators, who typically act impulsively during emotional crises. His months of preparation indicated he knew exactly what he was doing and worked systematically to achieve it. This calculation made him more dangerous, not less. Impulsive killers make mistakes. Planners cover their tracks. The ambiguity about whether Roberto murdered his children or simply kidnapped them didn't actually change the psychological profile significantly. Both scenarios required the same fundamental pathology, the ability to completely disregard his children's well-being in service of his own psychological needs. If he kidnapped them to keep them from their mother, he subjected them to years of trauma, stolen identity, severed connections, and forced isolation. He prioritized his need for control and revenge over their need for stability, education, extended family, and relationship with their mother. This constitutes profound child abuse even if he never laid violent hands on them. If he murdered them, he made an even more horrific calculation: that their deaths served his purposes better than their lives. Perhaps he viewed their murders as the ultimate revenge against his ex-wife. Perhaps he genuinely convinced himself he was saving them from something. Perhaps he simply couldn't tolerate the thought of them existing in a world where he didn't control their every moment. Forensic psychologists who consulted on the case noted disturbing details in Roberto's pre-disappearance behavior. Friends and family reported he'd become increasingly fixated on what he perceived as injustices in the custody arrangement. He spoke frequently about how the system favored mothers, about how Father's rights were trampled, about how he was being victimized by an unfair legal process. This victimhood narrative is classic among family annihilators. They reframe their circumstances to cast themselves as the injured party, the one who's been wronged beyond tolerance. This psychological reframing serves crucial purposes. It justifies extreme actions, transforms them from perpetrators to victims acting in self-defense, and allows them to maintain internal self-image as good people forced into terrible choices by circumstances beyond their control. Roberto likely spent months, possibly years, constructing this narrative. Every child support payment became evidence of exploitation. Every custody exchange became evidence of humiliation. Every moment when he wasn't in absolute control of his children became evidence of persecution. The actual reality, that he was going through a perfectly normal, legally standard divorce proceeding, couldn't penetrate this self-constructed fiction. This psychological distortion explains the methodical nature of his planning. He wasn't acting in blind rage. He was executing what he'd convinced himself was a justified response to intolerable circumstances. The research into remote locations, the financial preparations, the document gathering, all of it made perfect sense within his warped internal logic. Criminal psychologists studying the case debated whether Roberto fit diagnostic criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, or represented some hybrid pathology. The consensus suggested elements of multiple disorders, creating a particularly dangerous personality constellation. He demonstrated the narcissist's inability to tolerate ego injury, the sociopath's lack of genuine empathy, and the obsessive planner's methodical execution. His pre-disappearance behavior showed escalating red flags that the legal system failed to detect or properly weight. He'd begun making statements to friends about how his ex-wife would regret what she'd done. He'd told his brother that she was going to discover she'd made a terrible mistake. He'd mentioned to a coworker that sometimes people pushed him too far and would have to live with the consequences. These statements, examined in retrospect, read as obvious threats. But in real time, to people who knew Roberto as a generally controlled, functional person, they registered as understandable frustration, the kind of venting people do during difficult divorces. No one thought he was capable of following through. No one imagined he was literally planning his children's disappearance or deaths. This highlights a terrifying reality about family annihilators. They often function perfectly normally until they don't. Roberto held employment. He paid his bills. He maintained social connections. He presented as a rational adult navigating a difficult life transition. The monster lived beneath the surface, invisible until it emerged fully formed. The question of whether his children are alive or dead matters tremendously to his ex-wife, to the investigators, to everyone hoping for resolution. But from a psychological perspective, the distinction is almost academic. Either way, Roberto Arguelles prioritized his own psychological needs. His need for control, his need for revenge, his need to avoid the ego injury of shared custody, over his children's welfare, safety, and very existence. This is the core pathology of family annihilation. The absolute, narcissistic erasure of children's separate personhood. Whether they're dead and buried in the desert or alive and living under assumed names in some isolated location, Roberto Argels destroyed them. He destroyed who they were becoming, who they might have been. He severed them from their mother, their extended family, their community, their identity. If they're alive, they're living with a man who views them not as people but as weapons in his war against their mother. They're being raised by someone fundamentally incapable of genuine love, someone who sees them only as extensions of himself and tools for his purposes. The psychological damage from this upbringing would be catastrophic, creating trauma that would require decades to process, if they ever got the chance. If they're dead, they died at the hands of someone who should have been their primary protector. They died because their father's ego couldn't tolerate the completely normal, utterly unremarkable experience of shared custody following divorce. They died for no reason that would make sense to any psychologically healthy person. Understanding Roberto Argels doesn't excuse him. Nothing excuses what he did, but understanding the psychology helps prevent future tragedies. It helps family courts recognize warning signs. It helps mental health professionals identify high-risk individuals. It helps divorcing parents protect their children from partners showing similar patterns. The chilling truth is that Roberto Argels wasn't unique. Family annihilators destroy families with disturbing regularity. Some make headlines when bodies are discovered. Others, like Roberto, simply vanish, leaving behind questions that may never be answered. His pathology matters because it explains how someone can wake up one morning, pick up their children for a custody visit, and instead of taking them to the park or a movie, drive them toward oblivion. It explains how a father can look at his children's faces and choose destruction over devotion. It explains, but it doesn't excuse. It illuminates, but it doesn't justify. Roberto Argels made choices, methodical, calculated choices over an extended period. His psychological distortions may explain his capacity for those choices, but they don't diminish his responsibility for making them. Somewhere, the truth exists. Either two bodies lie in unmarked graves, or two adults are living stolen lives under fabricated identities, or something else entirely occurred that no one has yet imagined. Roberto Argels knows. The question is whether anyone else ever will. Decades have passed since Roberto Argels drove away with his children. The case file has grown thick with reports, interviews, dead-end leads, and unconfirmed sightings. The mother has aged, her face bearing the specific where that comes from decades of unresolved grief. The children, if alive, would be adults now, perhaps with families of their own, perhaps living entirely ordinary lives while carrying extraordinary secrets. The investigation technically remains open. Cold case detectives periodically review the file, looking for overlooked details or new technologies that might crack what has remained uncrackable. But with each passing year, resolution seems less likely. Trails grow cold not just metaphorically but literally. Witnesses die, memories fade, physical evidence degrades, and the world moves on. The impact of Roberto's actions extends far beyond his immediate family. Every unsolved case like this sends ripples through the broader community. Other divorced parents experience amplified anxiety during custody exchanges. Family court judges face the impossible task of weighing parental rights against vague intuitions of danger. Law enforcement agencies recognize the limitations of their ability to prevent determined individuals from harming their own children. The mother became an advocate, channeling her anguish into activism. She lobbied for changes to family law, arguing for more stringent evaluation of parents showing warning signs during custody proceedings. She pushed for better tracking of parental kidnappings, for dedicated resources to hunt abductors who flee with children. She spoke at conferences, sharing her story to audiences of judges, social workers, and law enforcement professionals, hoping her tragedy might prevent others. Her advocacy produced mixed results. Some jurisdictions implemented new protocols for identifying high-risk custody situations. Some police departments created specialized parental abduction response teams. But systemic change happens slowly, and the fundamental tension remains. Family courts must balance protecting children against preserving parental rights, And determining which parents pose genuine dangers versus which simply seem difficult remains an imperfect science. The children themselves, assuming they survived, occupy the most tragic position in this entire nightmare. If Roberto kept them alive, raised them under assumed identities, they've now lived most of their lives based on lies. They may have vague memories of another life, another mother, but those memories have likely been suppressed, distorted, or explained away through Roberto's manipulation. They might not even know they're missing. They might have been told their mother died, or abandoned them, or was dangerous. They might have grown up believing Roberto saved them from something terrible. The psychological reprogramming required to make children complicit in their own kidnapping is profound, but entirely possible with enough time and isolation. Or perhaps they know the truth. Perhaps they're living as adults, fully aware of their stolen identities, trapped by fear of their father or by the practical complications of revealing themselves. Coming forward after decades would mean confronting legal complexities, explaining gaps in their histories, potentially facing prosecution for identity fraud they committed as children. The barriers to revelation multiply with each passing year. If they're dead, the darker possibility that haunts every investigator. Their bodies rest somewhere in the vast emptiness of the American Southwest. Desert and mountain territories offer countless opportunities for concealment. Mine shafts, ravines, remote canyons, areas where human presence is measured in years rather than days. Finding two bodies in that immensity requires either extraordinary luck or specific information that only Roberto possesses. Some cold case investigators believe Roberto himself is likely dead. The same methodical planning that enabled his disappearance with the children might have concluded with his own death. Either suicide after murdering his children or succumbing to some accident or illness during years of living off the grid. If true, the truth died with him, leaving questions that will remain unanswered forever. Others believe he's still alive, living under an assumed identity, perhaps remarried with a new family who have no idea about his past. Criminals successfully disappear and rebuild lives more often than comfortable narratives acknowledge. With careful planning and discipline, someone can effectively cease to exist as their former identity and become someone new. Roberto demonstrated both the planning capacity and the discipline necessary. The internet age has added new dimensions to the search. Social media provides unprecedented tools for finding people, but also unprecedented opportunities for creating false identities. Facial recognition technology might theoretically identify the children from childhood photos if their current images appear online. But if Roberto or the children, now adults, avoid social media, maintain digital anonymity, or have sufficiently altered their appearances, technology offers no magic solution. True crime enthusiasts have adopted the case, creating online communities dedicated to amateur investigation. Some of this attention helps. It keeps the case visible, generates periodic media coverage, ensures new generations learn about these missing children. But it also creates noise, generates false leads that waste investigative resources, and sometimes causes additional pain for the mother through conspiracy theories or insensitive speculation. The mother checks her email daily, still hoping for the message that might change everything. She maintains hope that her children, her adults now, will somehow find their way back to her. She fantasizes about the knock on her door, the phone call, the reunion she's imagined thousands of times. She's prepared herself for every scenario, including the terrible ones, but preparation doesn't reduce the pain of living in perpetual uncertainty. She's created extensive documentation for her children in case they ever return. Letters explaining what happened, preserved memories of their early years, family photographs, medical records, everything they might need to reconstruct their stolen identities. She's established trust funds that await their return. She's maintained contact with investigators, ensuring that if any breakthrough occurs, she'll be immediately notified. But she's also had to build some form of life within the wreckage. She's worked, maintained friendships, tried to find moments of peace amid the permanent grief. She's discovered, as all long-term survivors of trauma discover, that life continues even when part of you remains frozen in the worst moment you've ever experienced. Other family members have been similarly impacted. grandparents who lost access to grandchildren, siblings who lost their niece and nephew, extended family whose gatherings are permanently marked by absence. Roberto's actions created concentric circles of suffering that extend far beyond the immediate victims. Some of Roberto's relatives maintain he's not capable of murder, insisting he must have simply taken the children to raise them elsewhere. Others believe the darker scenario, convinced that his rage and narcissism made murder not just possible but likely. Families fracture under this kind of pressure, divided by different interpretations of events and by blame for not recognizing warning signs earlier. The case has been featured on numerous true crime programs, podcasts, and articles over the years. Each retelling brings temporary renewed attention. Tips flood in for a few weeks, then taper off. Nothing concrete ever materializes. The cycle repeats every few years. Media coverage, public attention, tips, investigation, dead ends, silence. An endless loop producing no resolution. Forensic genealogy represents the newest hope. The same DNA techniques that have cracked decades-old cold cases might theoretically help identify remains if the children's bodies are ever discovered. But this requires finding remains first, and the Southwest has swallowed secrets far more thoroughly than this one. The statistical reality is grim. Parental kidnapping cases that remain unsolved for decades rarely achieve resolution. Children who disappear into underground networks of assumed identities typically aren't recovered as adults. Murders without bodies become nearly impossible to prosecute even if suspects are eventually identified. Time is the ally of criminals and the enemy of justice. Yet the mother continues. She continues hoping, continues advocating, continues living in the space between despair and faith. She's become a figure of tragic perseverance, a symbol of parental love's refusal to accept impossibility. Her story inspires some and breaks the hearts of others who recognize the same nightmare could strike their own families. Roberto Argels, wherever he is, alive or dead, hidden or transformed, has left an indelible scar on the world. He's created suffering that radiates across decades, across relationships, across an entire community. He's generated questions that may outlive everyone directly involved in the events. The children, whether alive or dead, exist in a strange quantum state, simultaneously present in their mother's thoughts and absent from her arms, simultaneously frozen at the ages they vanished and aged into adulthood in computer projections, simultaneously victims who might still be saved and victims who died years ago. This case represents something larger than one man's pathology or one family's tragedy. It illuminates the darkest possibilities of family violence, the limitations of legal systems designed to protect children, and the particular hell of losing loved ones without confirmation of their fate. It demonstrates how thoroughly one person can destroy multiple lives through methodical planning and absolute selfishness. The hope, however statistically unlikely, is that somewhere, somehow, truth will eventually surface. Perhaps one of the children, if alive, will discover their real identity and make contact. Perhaps someone will stumble across remains and report them. Perhaps Roberto will have a deathbed confession or leave behind documentation. Perhaps the universe will offer the resolution that decades of active investigation couldn't provide. Until then, the case remains frozen in time. Two children walked into their father's custody and vanished. A mother has spent decades in agonizing uncertainty. Investigators have file boxes filled with dead leads and unanswered questions. The truth exists somewhere, known to at least one person, waiting for circumstances or courage or chance to bring it into the light. Roberto Argels doesn't hunt anymore. He's either dead or diminished, his power reduced to the secrets he keeps. But the consequences of his hunting continue. A wound that won't heal, a mystery that won't resolve, a family that can't fully grieve and can't fully hope. This is the legacy of family annihilation. Destruction that extends far beyond the immediate act, suffering that compounds across years, and questions that outlive the people who might have answered them. The monster wore a father's face, signed custody papers with murderers' hands, and drove two children toward a fate we still can't definitively name. And somewhere, in the vastness of the Southwest or the anonymity of assumed identities, that fate remains, waiting to be discovered. The truth is out there. It always is. The question is whether it will ever be found. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.